Okay, the teacher is calling class back to session. Please find your desk. Yeah, so we're just going to use ELCC for counting for wind and solar. And now no questions. Okay, let's move forward from there. Sorry, I kid. But as everyone starts to settle in the room, I'm going to start the discussion back up. And we ended before lunch on the idea of using 3 years of historic data. We talked a little bit about the idea of weighting those periods to give us our overall average forced outage rate that we would apply. And I think that is a good way of a good starting point for us for setting up the proposed changes. So with that, I'm going to move on and keep trying to push through with our forced outage rate discussion. We had scheduled that hopefully to end before lunch, but we spent quite a bit of time earlier in the discussions on the principles and some of the coordination issues. So I think that was time well spent. It was going to get asked regardless, so that was fine that we did that, but we're going to try to get through the rest of this as quickly as we can. Obviously, please jump in with any questions or feedback that you might have. So picking back up from where we left off, we are going to discuss initially the ELCC concept that we're going to continue to utilize for wind and solar resources. So what does that really mean? We put forth in this proposal a continuation of our prior position on the wind and solar resources, where we're saying that the CAISO will use the ELCC method to establish the UCAP values. So we're not going to provide an additional, accounting for forced outages for wind and solar resources, because we believe that those are already incorporated in the statistical analysis that the PUC provides through the ELCC counting methodology for the QC for wind and solar resources. And then obviously I want to note as well that this ELCC approach could be expanded to cover other types of resource technologies like storage or variable output DR, and perhaps the CAISO might need to apply a similar treatment for those resources as well. So again, the idea is to try to create establish a UCAP value for all resources. And so for these ones, we're going to just, set the UCAP equal to their ELCC counting value, because we believe that the, current methodology does incorporate, forced outage averages for those wind and solar fleets. And so that one was something we got a lot of feedback on last time. Some stakeholders had questions about it, so I'll pause here to see if anyone has any input. And we're going to have Peter, and then Carl, do you want to add on to that a little bit, and then we'll go to Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. We're not proposing to run a separate and distinct ELCC study methodology. We are planning on, working with in the construct and confines of the CPUC's proceedings. Because right now, again, they're capturing the, California-wide wind and solar resources. So we're not proposing something different than that. We're just simply proposing to utilize the numbers they derive for the QC values for those resources.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, that's a good clarification that might not have came through in the slide. Okay, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I just wanted to follow on that to some degree, because currently the PUC methodology, as I understand it, is undergoing changes, and I think we're all involved in what that is, and I think that needs to move forward. But it sounds like what you're just saying is that you're not going to do a separate competing ELCC study at all. I do note, though, that the DR and the variable output, I think the ISO has made that suggestion to the PUC. I'm not sure where that is at this point. But you again would only be dealing with things in the context of what the PUC puts out for those types of resources.
Yeah, that's the intent here. Is we think that obviously we want to create forced outage rate transparency for all resources, but for these ones that already have this kind of reduction in their capacity value baked into the statistical analysis that's done through this ELCC approach. We think we can just utilize that rather than trying to somehow pull out another additional, more resource-specific number for forced outages or something where, it would be perhaps overlapping on some of the amount of outage that was, considered through that analysis, that sort of thing. And then if they do want to, expand the use of ELCC to other methodologies, I think we'd have to consider how that would fit into this proposed framework for using, forced outage rates. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, one of the things you'll notice, absent from the presentation, but we do note it in the paper, is there are some resource technology types out there where we're still working on trying to assess what the UCAP would look like for them. So, we put DR up there as something that we think the ELCC could accommodate and could utilize that methodology, and so that would give us a tool there. But, ultimately, if the PUC doesn't go that route, we still need to think about how certain resources, DR, hydro, and some of the NGR type resources, how that would work under a UCAP counting rules, and quite frankly, we have not put forward a proposal on those technology types at this time. So,
and I would also just to add on to that too, I think it's important that we note that there are probably some QC type accounting things that need to get addressed through LRA decisions. Hydro is a big issue at the moment that maybe needs to get explored. Some of these things about variable DR. And storage technology, hybrid resources. So there's a lot of questions about how some of these counting rules should be done I think at a basic QC counting methodology level that's, will be worked through the RA process at the PUC, and I think we're going to participate in those as well. But I do just want to note that, there's also this additional layer of how could we do a forced outage rate in a UCAP that maybe layers on top of or is a component of the overall capacity value that's determined through some of these other LRA-driven proceedings and the actual QC methodologies for those resources. I'm going to go back to Jamie in the back, and then was there another? And then on the phone. Okay, go ahead, Jamie.
Jamie, CPUC. So the ISO is proposing to use ELCC for wind and solar, and I know Chris, you talked through a couple different, issues with use limited resources, but we do have the LRA currently values non-dispatchable resources based on an exceedance methodology, and I'm wondering if you are planning on also proposing that resources that are subject to the exceedance methodology be, exempt from the UCAP calculation or the E4D. Otherwise, you're double
exactly
penalizing.
Yeah. I follow you where you're going with that, Jamie. I think that, So we do need to think about some, as Carl noted, I think, we were trying to get more additional feedback from stakeholders in the prior iterations. We didn't get as much perhaps on some of those type of issues other than, you guys just consider how to do that. And I think we're still exploring what we think the best approach would be, but I think you're right. We have to avoid some kind of double penalty or where there's a double reduction for one forced outage counting that we come up with, and then the overall counting methodology like exceedance does take into account how much these things are on an outage on average for those resources. Things like that definitely need to be considered. So I think that there's stuff, again, hydro, DR, maybe the imports stuff that we really aren't exactly sure if and how we need to establish a forced outage rate for those specific resources, or if maybe we do need to have at least the forced outage rates, but maybe they don't get applied to the ultimate UCAP value. And so those are some of the more nuanced details that we really need to build up for the upcoming proposals, but we haven't really got into that much.
Right, and I think it kind of gets back to what Peter was trying to bring up, or maybe he was or he wasn't, this morning, which, we do have these working groups that are going to be happening in the RA space that are related to use limit, like the hydro QC. So thinking about how the output of that will flow into a final proposal will be important.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I commit to you that we will be participating in all those discussions. We've got our team here that works on all the CPC matters, and then Carl, myself, and everyone on our team will also be following those and hopefully participating to the extent possible down at the PUC workshops, and then incorporating any of that feedback. If there are, proposed this direction on how we would do, new counting rules, new QC rules at the LRA level, I think we really want to try to incorporate that. So we definitely are committed to, that's part of the whole coordination piece. It's not just one-way street where we're saying we're going to, put our proposals into the PUC process. It's also anything that's coming out of the PUC, these workshops and things that aren't necessarily like necessarily a formal proposal or anything, but will help lead to, formal proposals in the future. I think we want to consider those help guide them with our input, and then also, incorporate them into our thinking for this. So definitely a good suggestion, and just want to make sure that everyone's aware that that's our intent on that. I think we have one on the phone.
Yes, thank you. So Lindy will go ahead and go to the question in the queue.
We do have one question in the queue. Caller, your line is now open.
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. I don't quite understand the concept of UCAP. On the surface, it seems it's expected value of the capacity of a unit. The calculation is the NQC times the outage rate. And the expected value equals to the frequency times the capacity. This is true only under certain assumptions of your probability function. Either as uniform distribution, normal distribution, but if you plot your generator load curve, I'm not sure that's the distribution. So this formula could be just arbitrary. But I don't know what your rationale, what thoughts that you have behind this formula. I wonder if you can explain a little bit.
Well, it's really, that's a fair question. I think, we have initially put this out as a starting place because this is a generally accepted, way of creating a UCAP value across other regions as well. I think that IEEE is a group that actually came up with this approach originally, and then it kind of got adopted across some of the other regions historically. So, I think that that's fair. Obviously, when you talk about averages, you're obviously not going to be getting it 100% accurate all the time. And, I think that some of the other comments we've heard today, I think we do need to try to, put a little bit more rigorous analysis around some of these things related to forced outage rates. And, particularly with the way we do the calculation, I think we need to really explain exactly how we're going to do that. So, your point's well taken. I don't have more of a response than that at this point. But I think hopefully we can come to, agreement on the ultimate way that we're going to calculate these forced outage rates and the ultimate UCAP value and incorporate ways that, folks think we need to, make exceptions or, certain different nuances about the calculation itself. Carl, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, Tom, this is Carl at the ISO. I was just going to ask for a little bit more explanation. You say that, we understand that, again, this is sort of at some level an expected value, albeit one that has precedent in the other ISOs across the country. You talk about the impact the distributions may have. Are you talking about the distributions of the outages? And if so, can you please help me understand precisely how those impacts might, or what impacts those would have on the calculation, or I don't think I would argue it's arbitrary. I think it is, it's a known calculation. Just help me understand a bit of the concern you have of an arbitrary nature of the calculation.
Well, let's say you have a frequency and then you convert that frequency to probability. Then you say, okay, this unit, there is a 95% of the chance it's going to operate at its full capacity, but there is a 5% chance that this unit may have a derate. And could it be a complete derate, could be a partial derate. But then you multiply this 95% with the capacity value, full capacity value. Then you say, this is my expected value in terms of a megawatt. I don't think that's automatic. This conclusion is true only if this is like a uniform distribution. Basically, you assume that an outage can occur at any output level with the same probability. or you say this is a normal distribution with the mean to be the UCAP. Or you can say this is a binomial distribution, and it's going to be either on or completely off with a probability of the 95%. But these are different assumptions you can make to make this formula correct, theoretically. But you haven't really showed the probability density function. You do have a frequency charge there, but if you convert it into a generation load duration curve, then you may be able to see actually what kind of a distribution it is, whether this assumption is true or is not true.
So, again, I think the examples Chris showed you earlier demonstrate that it's not binomial. It's not a all on or off. That there's, the calculation can deal with partial D-rates. And again, I don't know that, I'm struggling with some of the assumptions you're asking that we make here. Again, what we're looking at, or what we proposed is to rely on historical information, which I think typically is designed to minimize the assumptions you're making about probabilities and distributions. You're just simply looking at observations, and yes, you can arrive at and derive distributions from that. But, by and large, again, I think relying on the expected value of those when you are allowing for partial D-rates of any resource, you should still end up at a solution that I'm not understanding how it's arbitrary.
Well, let me jump in here too, Carl. I think I want to talk about this slide 32, which will hopefully help answer some of those questions, because the calculation that I think you have a fair point, though. You just talked about the UCAP calculation, the very simplified formula we put up there. I understand where you're coming from, but the way that we address some of those concerns that you raised, we haven't got into all the details of this, so this is, a bit more in-depth discussion on particularly the, statistical aspect of this. But on this slide 32 here, I just want to note that we try to account for some of those things like you're mentioning, where there's a partial D-rate and things like that. So this is the proposal for the standard IEEE formula for effective forced outage rate. And you look at the forced outage rate hours, you look at the equivalent forced D-rated hours, and then the overall service hours. And the way that you calculate the equivalent forced D-rated hours really matters here, and that really is what drives kind of the ultimate forced outage rate that you would apply to do the UCAP, where I think that would account for some of these things that you're mentioning in your concerns. So I think we do need to, discuss that more. Again, this is just an initial proposal, but I think once we get into the details of how we would do this forced outage rate calculation, that's really where we can nail down, is this appropriate, and should we, include some consideration of some of those other broader issues related to, probabilities and statistical analysis, and then things like, partial D-ratings and partial outages on resources and during, a certain amount of hours, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that helps answer some of the concern. I think, we're still not quite there to the level of detail that I think you're getting at. Some of our proposal might still, need some additional details there to help respond, fully to that kind of a question. Do you have any follow-up on that, though?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the calculation of the outage rate. I don't understand the application of the outage rate to the NQC to come up with the UCAP, because this formula is NQC times the outage rate may not be the expected value, unless you assume certain distribution. And, my real concern is that based on this formula, you may discount the capacity of the unit unnecessarily.
Okay, so I really appreciate if you could, kind of.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to say if you could incorporate that feedback in your written comments so that we understand really, the nuance behind where you're going with that. Whatever you might suggest that we modify on that, UCAP calculation, I think we're open to modifying it in ways that, could meet our particular needs here in California. So, anything you could provide as far as the written feedback of maybe some more of these details. Also, if you'd like to, discuss this a little bit more offline, you could feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to, talk in depth offline after this meeting, at a later time as well. But I appreciate the input and the question.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to Vic here in the room.
Just a quick question on slide 32, Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas and Electric. In the numerator of your equation, is that EFDG or is that EFDH?
Oh, that should be DH, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I just typed in, actually the formula is wrong. That should be EFDH in the formula, not in the lower part down. So, sorry, that was a typo. So for everyone on the phone, the G here in the upper part of the equation should actually be H, and it should match up with the third sub-bullet here, the equivalent force derated hours. Sorry about that typo. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this slide, but actually, well, we're on it already, I might as well. So again, I kind of already noted this, but this is just the initial standard formula that, it's been adopted and updated into the approach for calculating the E4R, the effective forced outage rate that's applied in other regions. We think that this is a good starting point, but obviously there's some nuance here that we need to make sure works in California. So if folks have feedback about, how we could apply this kind of a calculation, we're open to that. And I think that that's a, big part of the overall proposal is to make sure we get this calculation right. But let's go back to the other slides that we skipped over before we got to slide 32. Okay, so this slide is important related to the RAIN provisions and forced outage replacement. So this is something that, folks had asked a few questions related to earlier along the earlier parts of the presentation today. And one of the things that, we need to talk about when we're discussing this proposal to incorporate forced outage rates into the counting rules is, should we still have, some of these provisions in place for providing forced outage replacement? How would that work? What about RAIN application to these things if we were going to count against folks' capacity values, things like that. So right now what we're initially proposing is that we're going to assess all forced outage rates against the, all forced outages against the forced outage rate of a specific resource, use that to calculate the resulting UCAP values, and that we will not include forced outage replacement as an option for addressing forced outages in the future. What does that really mean? So that means you can't substitute and then help your forced outage rate out. If you actually go on a forced outage, we want to know specifically you were on a forced outage, and then you can't just go and buy another resource, substitute it for a couple of days, and have that, not count against you on your other resource. We really want to make transparent how much is each actual individual resource really providing reliability. So that's part of this proposal, is to remove that potential. So we only have replacement substitution requirements for planned outages that would require those. And we'll talk a little bit more about the planned outage proposal a little bit later today. But that's a big part that we're wanting to put out and, let stakeholders know that we're thinking that that's a part of the requirements of creating this proposal and moving to this new paradigm. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's Mark Smith at Calvin. I got confused when I read this section. Are you then therefore going to derate the future UCAP, due to a forced outage, derate the future UCAP and assess a current penalty? You're going to do both? Okay.
No, that's not what we're, so, and then also, let me just finish that last bullet. Hopefully that answers you as well. We're not going to assess resources during RAIN, during periods that they've already submitted a forced outage. So that way you wouldn't be getting a penalty on top of having your future UCAP dinged. That's the intent here. So basically, I wanted to put these all on one slide because it's all interrelated. Obviously, you can't provide substitute capacity if you're going on forced outage, so that way we can actually get a transparent future UCAP value for you. for your resource, and then additionally, we wouldn't assess RAIM during the period that they actually submitted the forced outage. So that's the idea, that, or the overall concept. I mean, at least initially that we're putting out there. We really need to think more about RAIM, how this all fits in with that, and avoid, creating something that's like an inappropriate double penalty, or somehow, otherwise double penalizing a resource for the, the same outage.
Okay.
Essentially.
Yeah, obviously, that's where I was headed.
Yeah.
On the next page, show that your calculation. I just want to make sure that planned outages don't show up in the numerator or the denominator here, correct?
That's right. So,
okay.
Yes, we will be removing, any planned outages that's approved by the CAISO does not count against your forced outage rate. And then we actually will talk a little bit more about, some changes to the way that the planned outage process will need to be incorporating, something different from today that related to, if you need to take a forced outage, again, that would, basically you can still go on the forced outage, but now it would count against your UCAP, your forced outage rate again. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the subsequent sections as well. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Welcome back. Sorry we had some technical difficulties there. Can I check to see if folks on the phone can hear me? Operator? Okay. Just keep going? Okay. Let us know if you can't hear us. Okay. Seriously, let's move on. Okay. So I think we do need to think a little long and hard about the RAIN piece and some of these other things a little bit more in depth before we really provide more detail in the next proposal. So we'll think a little bit about that because it's good feedback, good questions. Please put that stuff in your written comments if you guys have thoughts on that because we are still, in the development phases thinking about that as well. So on the forced outage rate data, we wanted to think about, how can we get the right information to calculate these forced outage rates. Prior proposals, we initially discussed the CAISO OMS system that we have in place right now, that we talked a little bit about earlier, and then the NERC GAD system. And we explained that generally in other regions they use the NERC GAD system to calculate these forced outage rates. We also note that basically they actually, in those regions, they actually report everything to NERC on behalf of those entities, of those resource owners and resources. So they actually track everything at the ISO, at like MISO, PJM, New York. They actually track those values and then they actually submit them to NERC on behalf of them. So I think that's one of the ways they can get that level of detailed information. For us, we can't actually get that specific NERC information on individual resources unless we were to, go through a process where we incorporated that into our tariff and when, actually, requested that from all of the resources. And we think that, that could work, but there's some issues related to that we outline in the proposal. It doesn't go down to the smaller resource sizes. I think it only goes down to like 20 megawatt resources. And then, it doesn't track every single different type of nature of work card that we use here for our outage tracking. So that's really why we're thinking and leaning towards enhancing our OMS system to create an approach where we can get the right data and track outage rates accurately for all the specific individual resources on our own with our own system rather than relying on the NERC GAD system. So that's really where we're thinking we're going to go on this part of the proposal. Really, again, we think that we can use the nature of outage, or nature of work outage cards to actually, create a good definition of what should count against the resources forced outage rate and what shouldn't. We'll go through those in the next couple slides here. Okay, I'm not going to go over this one again, but this is the initial proposal for the way we would do the calculation. Obviously, I think there's some nuance we can talk about, like this next slide here on that. One of the major things that, we want to avoid is counting forced outages against resources, forced outage rate if it's not really in their control. So that's one of the major concepts that's included in other regions is that they exclude outside of management control outages from the forced outage rate calculation. So on this slide, we have an example here, a transmission-induced outage or some other kind of, force majeure event like a wildfire. that forces a resource to be actually an outage that really shouldn't count against their forced outage rate. They could have been available otherwise. You know, it wasn't like their machine broke or their inverter failed or whatever. And so that's kind of the idea that we want to try to incorporate here as well, because we really think you have to have a clear, well-defined definition of what outages count, what outages don't count against the forced outage rate. And we think that there is some nuance there and some of these things, you know, that obviously folks that have been working in this area know that some things are really outside of their control, but it could still be a forced outage, and maybe that shouldn't count against them. So that's kind of the idea we're proposing to incorporate into the accounting rule here for forced outages. And on this slide, we, sorry, a little bit of it got cut off. Oh, no, never mind. Looks good up there. So on this one, this essentially is listing of all of our forced outage cards, nature of work that we are going to try to look at to say, you know, should that actually lower a resource's UCAP, or in other words, is that going to count against your forced outage rate or not? And so the idea here is, you know, all these different types, yes, no, yes, no. If it says yes, then it would be counting against your ultimate UCAP value if you went on that kind of an outage. So that's the intent with this one. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I will pause and see if there's any questions on any of that stuff I just covered. Eric, go ahead.
Eric from Edison, and if we need to take this offline, that's fine. I've tried to ask our folks back at the shop this question, and I'm not sure that I have a clear answer yet. The ambient due to fuel insufficiency, I thought that this was a category that was put in for the Aliso Canyon issues. So the question is, if this is the inability to get fuel because of a gas system constraint, shouldn't that be out of the control of the resource? But then you've got to split that into a person who didn't try to buy gas day ahead versus a person who simply got curtailed. And I'm not sure exactly how to handle that yet, but it just draws the question of what is that category, what's it intended to do?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'll just first start by just responding that I think you're correct that there's probably a nuance between someone who tried to buy gas and couldn't, or, you know, someone who just decided that they weren't going to do that. And maybe those two things really should be treated a little bit differently, perhaps. I think that that's something we need to think about. Maybe we need to add some new kind of, you know, nature of work cards to address something like that, perhaps. So I think we're open to that, but I do want to see if David have any additional input on that initial card. I think it was because of the Aliso Canyon initially. That was what, or that's what we're supposed to be using it for now, correct?
So yeah, this is Abdul. The ambient not due to temp is what people can use for Aliso Canyon, and that one is, you know, that's why it's exempt.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So you can use it if you're exempt from rain today, tomorrow you'll be exempt from a UCAP D rate, and that one is if the gas is outside your control. In that case, so if you know, it's within your control, you didn't plan well, whatever, the schedule coordinator didn't get the correct amount of fuel, that's where fuel insufficiency is for. So it's within their control, and that's why they're subject to the D rate.
Thanks, Abdul. That's very helpful. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Over here.
Christopher McLean, California Energy Commission. Would it be terribly difficult to get statistics over some period of time about how frequently each of these nature of work cards are used?
I think we could probably do some analysis on it. I don't know if we're going to get, you know, a real clean data set, but I think, you know, we could maybe say like how many instances, perhaps, maybe not the duration and magnitudes, but perhaps you could see, you know, this one was, you know, however many numbers of outages or something like that. But we'll explore some of that data. Carl, you add?
Yeah, just as a note, when Chris was going through the examples earlier, the forced outage rates and what it took to compile those and the data questions we had, a lot of them arose from these nature of works. And so we don't want to provide data that's, you know, once we've got that ironed out, it will probably be a lot easier to put out some summary statistics, but we don't want to put out anything that's going to be confusing and or misleading until we've kind of parsed out, you know, an instance of this, you know, was used 3 times for resources that had incremental D rates, you know, went on over a period of time. We want to make sure the data we put out can be interpreted reasonably and not confuse people more than it's helping them.
That sounds good. And I guess to the extent possible, if at all, these things could be mapped to, I guess, how the cards end up being used for the curtailed and non-operational gen report, the sort of historical 1515. It's an 0830 report now, but ultimately there's a daily snapshot of each resource that gets flagged as planned or forced. How are these cards sort of driving that report? If
I don't know. I'm going to look to Abdul and see if you have any initial thought on doing that. I think we could try to do that kind of analysis, but, basically the question is asking, when we look at that overall report that we have daily, how much resources we have on outage, could we break it down and say this was from this nature of work, this is, that kind of thing. I think we could try to get into that kind of analysis, or we'll at least, at the very least, we're going to take a look at it and see what we'll do. But again, to Carl's point, I think the reason why we held back a little bit from providing more thorough analysis on some of the forced outages is because of kind of some of these things I talked to about, to my response to Mark earlier about the differences in the data and overlapping outages and sometimes the partial derates. And so we really need to set up the definitions and to Carl's point, in the future we should be able to track this stuff much more cleanly once we set up the system, but to try to go back and parse through some of the data that wasn't set up to do it is a bit difficult, and it just takes a lot of time to really clean it up, make sure get the right numbers. So to try to do it for all the outages on, a whole year or something is just kind of infeasible amount of work to do. So I think we could do it for, some dates and get some example dates perhaps, and a good way to start the analysis at least. So it's a fair request. We'll think about how we could do that.
Great. What I'll point out is, this is David from the ISO, in a recent FERC filing on some tweaks to the BRAME exemption for outage outside operator control, we did provide some statistics about some of the specific natures of work over the recent past, and it was, I forgot when the filing was, spring of this year, so you can look on our website. There's some information on that, not comprehensive, but at least to start giving folks some sort of general idea of some of these.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think we can pull some of that information up and take a look at that and see how it could maybe expand on it a little bit. Okay. Carl right here, and then.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note this, kind of re-emphasize some of the points Chris made earlier, which is to say these are a list of nature of work cards as they exist today. That's not to say that we're not looking at and considering what needs to be changed or how to adjust these moving forward, or if other ones need to be met to address Eric's point earlier. So again, this is just kind of an assessment of where we're at today, particularly as we try and put together our analysis of what the system UCAPs would look like under today's configurations.
Okay, let's go back here. Carrie, go ahead.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to whether you'd want to change how you're doing the use limit, use limited process and the different nature of work categories. You have a seasonal RA counting, and then you have monthly and annual use limit reaches. It seems like the availability will be different between the seasons, and it seems like you'd want to assess the use limited resources perhaps in a different way than other resources. I mean, if to Carl's point earlier, you were saying that you really want to assess the resource for the actual amount of reliability it's providing, and use limited resources tend to have a trend on when they're providing reliability that is either seasonal or monthly. And for this, you just exempt them whenever they hit their use limit. So it seems like they'll get full UCAP if you're a use limited resource and you hit your use limitations.
Yeah, so a couple things there. A lot of it's related to how our treatment of the use limitation concept under the CCE 3 proposal. So I think we're intending that the management of those use limitations should be done through the market, through the opportunity cost. I think Callie was working on that stuff, so I'm not necessarily an expert on CCE 3 myself. I wouldn't really want to opine exactly how that works at this point. I think we could have Greg or someone else help. But if Carl wants to add something, that might be useful here, because I'm lacking right now.
Yeah, no. The question about how I think it's less about how resources under CC3 that have that opportunity cost provision would be dealt with. I think under those scenarios, once they've reached that use limitation, I think one I could see the argument one way or the other about whether or not you would treat that as a forced outage from a reliability standpoint. I think you probably would. I have to think through that more. The bigger question does arise, though, for those resources that are use limited but don't have that opportunity cost adder into them. That creates something a little bit more complex that we can sit down and work through. Again, I don't know that that's insurmountable, but it's a question that we'll answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, we need to think about how we would do it with the ones that do have that opportunity cost treatment, and then the ones that don't have might need to be different. And I think that those ones, basically determining all these forced outage nature of work cards, that we really want to make sure that all those cover everything that we might need to cover. If we need to adjust them, we can do that as well through this process to cover that. So I think that that's a fair request. Looking at it, maybe the seasonal type of an approach too, if that needs to line up with the forced outage rate, concept. If we're going to do it on a seasonal basis, we might need to do that too. I don't think we've got into level of detail yet, but that's a fair request, so we'll think a little bit more about that. Go ahead, Vic.
Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas Electric. I had a question on the pecking order here, and I'm sure you'll cover it more with the local, but I think you can buy a unit that's in a local area but only say it's for system peaks currently, and
that's right.
How do you determine the pecking order then? That unit has a forced outage, it's in a local area. Do you go to the contract to see if it's system, to see if it's a UCAT situation and they don't get RAIM, or it's in a local area so they do it's an NQC basis and it has to do substitution and will receive RAIM? I guess I need more clarity around, we're getting off the paradigm that local always counts for system. That was something we could use for years. Now it seems like that's sort of up in the air until we get all these other details worked out. And I know they haven't been worked out yet, but it's something to keep in mind as we go through this.
Yeah, so all I'll say is I agree with you. I think we do need to think about that hard, and I think that, that's a good question that I don't feel comfortable trying to respond to at this point, because we just haven't gotten to that level of depth in the proposal yet on some of those concepts. So I'll just leave it at that. But I do think we really need to think hard about how this would all apply in that kind of hierarchy, and how it should apply to local, and if we still need to apply RAIN to local RA or not for forced outages, or allow for substitution, some of those other questions that were asked earlier. Those are still up in the air. If you guys have thoughts about how it could all work together, we're open to thinking about how it should work. Go ahead, Carl.
Vic, this is Carl from the ISO. I'd also like to note that in many of the local areas, the opportunities for finding substitute capacity are going to become much more limited, and so trying to figure out what is RAIN providing in that place. Are we incentivizing a resource to go out and find capacity that isn't there, or we're just kind of in a place where the ISO has no choice but to kind of rely on what's available to it? And is there something more that mechanism is providing in terms of incentive, or is it just turning into a punitive penalty at that point in time? So we get the balance that you're interested in additional clarifications for, but at that point in time, we're continuing to explore if RAIN is providing that value even at the local area, given the limited options we have.
Go ahead, Eric.
Eric from Edison. So following up on that, and for exactly those reasons, I don't think we should be dismissive of the idea that we simply use an E4 methodology for everything, and we simply get rid of the NQC methodology altogether. Because I think there is a lot of simplicity to it. I think that if you do apply RA-AIM to a resource, imagine a resource that is shown on somebody showing as being both a system resource and a local resource. If we decide that we have to go down the path that we're going to have E4 for the system resources and we're going to have RA-AIM for the local resources, you get into the double penalty that Mark was mentioning. And that complexity and trying to deal with this is going to be a very difficult thing to do. So I'm not convinced that it's the answer yet, but I don't think we should be dismissive of the idea that we simply move away from NQC altogether.
Well, I think you have some good points there, I guess I would say I don't think we can move away from NQC altogether because of some of the things that Lauren's going to talk about, like the must-offer obligation and how you actually get the reliability from the resources. I think you still need to have the must-offer associated with the NQC that's been shown for resources. So that's a big component of the proposal. But I think that, a fair ask is, should we continue to do local on, the NQC type of requirement basis, or should we be doing that on a UCAP basis as well, and incorporating forced outage rates for local resources? And, I don't see Catalin in the room today. He's our guru on all the local stuff. But, I did ask him about this, and we had some internal discussion about should we, propose that and move to that. And it really, I think that the benefits of it might not really outweigh the complexity that's created, but I think we do need to have that discussion a little bit further. And I guess I would just say, we're not wedded to for sure having to say we're going to keep, NQC for local, but again, we definitely don't want to create a situation where we're getting like double penalties or somehow double counting forced outages against resources. And since we have local and it is a subset of the system and certain aspects, and local can be shown for system but not for local, and those kind of issues, we really need to think hard about how that fits together in this proposal. And I think we're just not there yet to give you guys all the nuanced answers that you guys want. But we will be trying hard to get to that point.
Eric, this is Carl. One last point on that. As we continue to look into and explore how we can keep this simple and tractable solution, part of the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how are we establishing the local requirements, and what do they mean? And so trying to figure out if we're able to transform those requirements into a UCAP valuation. We're open to how that can occur. We haven't found that solution yet. So if Edison's got one, or if anybody has one, quite frankly, about how to express a local requirement in terms of forced outage capacity, that would help a lot. But again, as Chris has also noted earlier today, the offer obligations, as it is in all the other ISOs that rely on a UCAP valuation, the offer obligation is still based on the installed capacity or NQC value. And so having that there so that there's an understanding of what type of offer obligation they have once under an RA contract, that remains important. So those are the considerations why we've thought about and are currently considering maintaining NQC as a number we publish and has some meaning and significance. But again, if we can move past and express those in other terms, we're open to those solutions. We just haven't found a solution to do that yet.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the first time I looked through the paper and had these discussions in the first sets of these workshops, I kind of thought that the NQC was really just what the offer obligation was going to turn out to be, which I'm okay with that because, quite frankly, that the UCAP is really just an accounting methodology. And when it comes down to what they have to actually make available to the ISO, that may be a different number. I'm comfortable with that. Where I'm not comfortable is where you have different sets of compliance requirements for resources that are effectively providing the same thing. I guess I'm not sure in a local setting how it's really any different anyhow. The reality is what the ISO is looking at is a certain amount of load and a certain amount of grid constraints, and they need a certain amount of generation operating during that amount of time. If it's on a forced outage rate, it's not operating during that amount of time, which is really no different than system. Now, you're right, we have certain sub-areas that right now you need all of the NQC that's there, and presumably the UCAP is going to be lower than that. But all that really reveals is that there's a deficiency in certain areas more than what people had thought that there was before based upon the NQC methodologies. And so if all that we're getting to is just a more clear depiction of how many resources are available in a local area to serve the local need by going to an E4 methodology, well, okay, maybe it's putting light on something that needs to have light shed on it.
As much as it pains me to say this, Eric, that's a fair point. We'll take it into consideration. Yeah, go. Just go. All right. Thanks, Eric.
I agree. That was something that we need to think about. I agree with the idea and concept, and I think again, one of the drivers behind some of the initial thinking is just the way that we do the existing technical studies are all based off NQC, trying to avoid, any impacts to those studies is a big concept as well, so that we need to think about. So more here. I'm going to go back to here and then over to Peter. So back to the room.
Yeah, Grant from Wellhead. Not to belabor this, but when it comes to local, isn't it true that it's the total availability, the total outage rate? Because you're not available if you're on planned outage either.
So you're saying that we should incorporate planned outages into the capacity value?
I'm not necessarily suggesting that. I'm just saying the reality of the situation is that even planned outages in a local area, that generation is not available.
Grant, this is Carl. Yes, I think the big difference on these calculations and terminations is the ability to have the ISO approve or disapprove a planned outage and potentially move that around to, a time that is, finger quotes, more convenient or when we're having less stress on the system. So we have optionality with the planned outages that we just don't have with the forced outages because those are the, oops, it happened and now we just have to deal with it, whereas the plan, maybe we could say, well, we're dealing with somebody else's force, can you move that around and solve that problem that way? So yes, we worry about the planned outages, but we do have some control over those at some level.
So, I'm hearing we just really need to, really expand and frame up and discuss the local concept and how this fits in with this better in our future proposals. So, we've heard that feedback. We're going to try to do that for you guys to help justify the proposal, make it more clear what we really intend, and provide some of those details that you guys are asking about in future proposals. Okay, Peter?
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I just wanted to get clarity. I think you just said that you were not looking to change the local study methodology at all, and that you would like to try and make all of these adjustments keeping the existing study methodology.
That is one of the drivers of why we haven't proposed that we would incorporate UCAP into the local at this point, because of the local studies, with the feedback we've got from Catalan during these discussions is basically that, if we could do that kind of a study, it would just change the whole process and, require a bunch of updates to that local capacity technical study process that would probably ultimately result in something that looked very similar to the ultimate requirements that we have today, with a lower amount of capacity that actually counts towards qualifying towards meeting those needs. But I think, without going through that full process and really doing the whole technical study on that basis, I don't think we have a specific, exact answer on that, but that's one of the reasons where we, have been thinking maybe it's not appropriate to go down the UCAP concept with the local resources.
Okay, I'm just trying to get clarity on what the intent is, and the intent is to try and leave the local as untouched as possible.
To the extent possible. I mean, if it requires, if this overall proposal, if we, when we talk about this stuff a little bit further, try to develop some of these answers to how we would treat, substitution and rain for and other related incentives, and then the forced outage rate concept for local, I think we do need to think about, do we need to change that paradigm? At this point, we're not going that far to propose that we would change it because of mainly the reason is because we want to keep the local capacity technical study static as possible, and we think that it could all work together how it is currently designed with this new layer on top of it. But as you heard, people are asking more questions about getting more details on exactly how this would be treated, with rain, some of these incentives, replacement obligations, the interaction between local and system, and so we need to really flesh out those details before we can give you guys a good sense of, do we really think we want to keep the current, local capacity technical study and base off of NQC for local and still have this, forced outage rate for system and flexible.
Okay, so if I understand that, you'd like to stay the course on the local, stay tuned as to whether or not changes need to be made depending upon what happens.
Yeah, that's a quick way of saying that. Thanks.
So this is Jamie. So effectively you're proposing to unbundle local and system, right? This is part of the proposal?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Because from a contracting perspective, you would be contracting for two kind of separate products.
I don't think so.
One was potentially like substitution, and based on NQC, and then you'd be contracting for the system piece, which would be based on UCAP, which would
I think we would avoid both of those. I think we want to avoid having that kind of a dual contracting issue to the extent possible. I mean, really the idea is going to be, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next couple of slides too, about how we would, coordinate this with the PUC, but I think, to your point, we want everybody to still be buying like the NQC of resources, and then I think the issue about, the substitution requirements and that might be different on local. That could create some issues there. We need to think about how that would work. Maybe we need to, provide some allowance for modification so that doesn't create, something that goes sideways with the proposed, system concept. But I think that we still want, even for system resources, people to be buying NQC, but knowing how much of the UCAP concept it would actually count towards for each of those, specific resources as well. And that's why we'll get into the next couple slides too about the idea of, how does this PRM versus UCAP concept really work, and it's kind of a subset of that, and the ideas behind that concept a little bit further.
And Jamie, just to kind of further that point, we're not proposing that, when I think of the unbundling, I think of the ability to put a resource on one showing and not the other. We allow for a system, a resource in a local area to be shown as system only, but not to have a resource that's local, not, then sell a system attribute to another LRA. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. So we're not seeing this as an unbundling per se where you can kind of transact the different products across an LSE. It's still tied to, that resource.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. That's helpful, I think. So, well, it was helpful in my mind. Hopefully that's helpful to everyone else. So time check, we're getting behind here, guys, so I want to try to move through the next couple slides quickly, but this next part is what I was, talking about earlier, coordinating the proposed UCAP concept with PUC and other LRA programs. We talked a little bit about this earlier. I'm going to try to move these pretty quick so I can move on and let Carl take over the reins for a little bit here on some of the next parts of the proposal. But again, really, we're committing, we really want to provide this coordination with the PUC and other LRAs to the extent it's necessary. We really think that addressing these forced outages up front in the planning horizon is vital. And, one of the things we're thinking about as well, if LRAs just adopted a similar accounting approach, that could minimize any administrative complexity. Obviously, we can't count on that happening for sure, especially across all LRAs. And if the PUC was to do that, that might go a long way in trying to, avoid any, conflicting procurement decisions or anything like that. But I think, we really still think that you can have a system RA requirement that's based off of an installed capacity PRM, but also have the UCAP concept. So that's kind of a couple slides I want to talk about. But again, we will have this collaborative effort we talked about earlier where we try to, incorporate our proposal and any of the scoping into the PUC's process so they understand, where we're coming from and what our proposal would be and how they might need to update their, rules and regulations to reflect that stuff. Hopefully that should be, good to help coordinate on both sides, go in both directions. But again, this idea that some stakeholders have been expressing some concern that this, would create some kind of double procurement target or two, incompatible procurement targets for system RA. We think that, essentially it's very interrelated, but it's not incompatible. We think that the UCAP requirement is simply just a subset of the established PRM target, so you could still have an installed capacity PRM of 115%, and we could still do all the same things we do today on the NQC concept, but also layer in this UCAP concept. And it's just essentially trying to, take out the idea of removing the additional margin for forced outages, making sure that we, statistically or probability-wise, take into account these forced outages up front in the planning horizon. We're actually procuring the resources. So we really get enough UCAP from resources up front as well as the, installed capacity through the PRM. So that's kind of the idea over here. Go ahead, Stephen.
Stephen Kelly with IB. Chris, when you talk about integrating forced outages in planning, which planning processes are you referring to?
So up front in the procurement RA process.
Just the RA.
Yeah, so I'm not talking like, IRP or longer or something like that. No, we just mean basically the difference between, in our mind, the planning horizon, which is really before the start of the month, and the RA, procurement time frame, and then in the intra-month, operation time frame when we see those forced outages happening. And that's really the difference because today we see, yes, the PRM covers for some forced outages, and then we have the rain concept and, replacement obligations to avoid those things. And so we get different amounts of replacement capacity based off of, each individual decision by resources in the intra-month time frame. So we don't really have as much certainty as if we were to move that front. know what the UCAP number for these resources are and have, good certainty that on average we will actually get enough resource, margin that we need ahead of time, rather than waiting into the month. Eric, go ahead.
Eric from Edison. So let me see if I can describe this a little bit better, because I think I was one of the people who said, an NQC and a UCAP methodology between the PUC and between the ISO is a difficult thing to do. It's not incompatible in the sense that the two undo one another. It's incompatible in the sense that one may weigh more heavily than the other, and you end up having to meet two different objectives. So, and I'm pretty sure you guys will get into this later, but as I understand the proposal, there's not only an individual LSE check, but then there's also this kind of cumulative capacity check that gets done. The way that the RA process today has worked is that we have known a priori whether or not the resources we're procuring are going to meet our obligation. The only exception to that is in local, and it's an exception in local because we don't know the effectiveness factors of the resources until they're after they're all shown. With a UCAP methodology, we know the effectiveness. What do you mean we don't? Why are you shaking your head?
No,
we know what their forced outage rate is.
Well, we know what their forced outage rate, but again, when we're thinking about the, again, finger quotes, effectiveness, remember there's more to how well a resource does in meeting our system needs than its forced outage rate. I mean, we have to know how well the resources as a whole, the portfolio as a whole, works together to maintain reliability over time. It's not simply an instantaneous point in time right now. So we can tell you from a forced outage rate standpoint, these resources are more reliable and thus probably going to increase your likelihood that, a collective deficiency, and I'll describe this eventually, what that looks like at a system level. But to say that we know its effectiveness before things have been shown is simply not true. We need to know what's been shown to understand, for example, how well we're able to meet an evening ramp or serve a net load peak or be able to serve gross load. It depends on what's shown in RA at that point in time. So we don't know that all a priori.
Right. So we're talking two different items right now. What you're effectively talking about is an item that we used to deal with through the MCC buckets. Arguably, that's the way that it worked, because when we had the MCC buckets, you didn't have so many use-limited resources, right? So the issue when you originally set this up was, and this is, 15 years ago now, we've got a lot of thermal resources. There were people who were doing peak load contracts, people who were doing 6x16 contracts, people who were doing 7x24 contracts. And so the whole idea of it was to match it up and say, okay, I'm not going to allow you to buy only peak load type stuff because you won't meet all of the other hours. So we put these buckets together, and under contractual terms, that worked just fine. Fast forward 15 years later, and that's not the types of constraints that we're under today. So effectively, the question that you're asking in that type of effectiveness is a question of whether or not the MCC buckets work. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who would say that they do. Maybe there is, but...
Can we pause a moment?
We can.
No, let's not.
But so I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not the MCC buckets need to do what they do, and I think there probably is a lot of agreement that we need to move to a methodology that accomplishes this. I think John Gooden, had said previously that we need to stop looking at just a kilowatt need, but also a kilowatt hour need. And I think we kind of agree with that. I think that's what we need to be able to meet reliability needs. But the idea then that you're going to have an NQC methodology to meet PUC requirements and a UCAP methodology to meet ISO requirements is completely separate from that.
Yeah. So here's what I'm going to suggest, Eric. Let's stick a fork in that, or a pin, or whatever is appropriate. I don't know.
How about both?
Okay, that's cool. It'll really stay in place that way. And we know that when I stand up there eventually to talk about this, that it's there. And I think that's the appropriate place to raise the concerns you've brought up. And my hope is that we can start to burrow down into solving them.
That's fair. I guess my point, though, is still, at least in my opinion, that a methodology that uses NQC and a methodology that uses UCAP in two different regulatory organizations is going to be problematic.
Okay. And I would just respond, and I think that the ISO would disagree that it would be problematic. I think that we're working under the impression or the assumption that we can make it work together. And, again, the idea of having the NQC still utilized in some of the things like local and for the must-offer obligations are important. We could still use that for procurement targets at an installed capacity level. and also have procurement targets for UCAP that aren't incompatible. And so I think, it's a fair point that you think that maybe perhaps one of them might have more impact or priority or something like that, or effectiveness, or, I forget the exact term that you used, but I think, that I don't think that we necessarily think that that's inappropriate, and that kind of is how in other regions that utilize the UCAP that they actually do, rely more heavily on making sure that they get the UCAP number because they're worried about maintaining reliability, according to the forced outages that they see in the system. So, but I think we have more stuff to talk about on that, so we'll think about it a little bit more. On the next slide here, this idea, again, is the over-procurement. I'm not going to keep beating a dead horse here on this, but we really think that we can avoid this double counting or over-procurement issue. It just really depends on how we set up the requirements, and then how the LRA is determined if they should update their requirements or somehow allow us to make sure these things work together. I think that's really the intent that we're trying to get at here, and we don't think that it's incompatible. So I guess I'll just stop at this point and see if there's any final questions on any of the coordination. We talked a lot about the process for coordination, so I'm not going to go over that again. But with that, let's try to catch up a little bit on the agenda and move on to Carl and his presentation. Any questions?
Christian, do we have anybody in the phone queue? Christian, operator?
Yes, there are no questions in the queue right now.
Great, thank you.
Thanks to everyone for your input and feedback on all these important issues. All right, Carl, go ahead.
So at the end of the day, we're going to ask stakeholders to provide feedback if the next stakeholder meeting should be scheduled for 3 days or if we should have 12-hour days, just to make sure we can spend the necessary time and effort in covering all the topics we've laid out. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the showings and how the ISO is contemplating and considering some new views of resource adequacy and what it means to have resource adequacy in terms of showings. Now, we spent a lot of the morning talking about the individual RA showings and the UCAP valuations and what those mean, but we've also recognized that over time we're starting to see a lot more use-limited resources, energy-limited resources with just varying levels of constraints on their ability to operate at all hours. And so we need to make sure that what we get is a fleet of resources, a portfolio of resources that ultimately works together to serve our load. And so we'll talk a little bit today about what we're calling the portfolio analysis and the deficiency tests. These tests are basically aligned to try and assess the fact that we realize that, yes, we still need to serve peak load. That doesn't go away. And that having forced outage rates included in the valuation of the resources, we expect over time will start to lead to incentives to provide more reliable capacity and have more reliable capacity procured as a means of trying to lower overall costs for procurement. But on top of that, even if we have reliable resources, if they don't function well together, we still will struggle to maintain reliable operations. So we're trying to balance this as we transition our portfolio to a different fleet. So we're looking to conduct a portfolio deficiency test of only RA resources. We're not going to be looking at the entire fleet of resources available to us. Again, there was a question, Brian, I think it was you earlier today, who asked, will the ISO be assuming and relying on free capacity? Part of what we're looking at here is to say, is the capacity that's being procured sufficient? If it's not, then we need to know that. And so what we're looking at really is strictly going to be the RA capacity as opposed to looking at the overall capacity. Okay, turn off my. We do want to try and maintain some simplicity here. Oh, wait, I got thrown off. I'm sorry, I skipped to the wrong page. The first step of the process, as Eric and I were just discussing, is going to be the idea of looking at the unforced capacity value to try and identify and establish individual LSE requirements so that they have something similar to what they've got for local now, which is kind of a general assurance that though not all costs are a regulatory risk is foreclosed, but the vast majority of them are, which is to say, once you've met a UCAP value, you have reasonable assurance that you are significantly mitigating the risk for additional costs, whether they be backstop costs or other deficiency type costs, and we'll talk about those. I think Gabe will cover that stuff tomorrow, so I don't want to steal Gabe's thunder, and I also want to expedite my presentation so Laura can get up here. But letting folks know that, again, to try and keep things as easy as possible, we don't want to necessitate more showings than necessary. So trying to have showings simply come in terms of NQC. This is how it works today, so hopefully we can maintain standard practices for showings as part of the effort here. But the idea is still that the UCAP values will be public, but you don't have to submit that. You don't have to change all these templates and how you're doing some of your showings, so we can simply have the NQC values come in. We'll have those same calculations for UCAP behind the scenes that you had in the public space, so we can do that conversion without you having to do it in your showings. Noting that partial RA resources would only get a proportionate value of the UCAP. So if you buy part of a 100 megawatt resource with a 10% forced outage rate, you would not get credit for 50 megawatts and say, hey, I bought the good stuff. You would get credit for 45 megawatts out of that 50 for UCAP valuation. Again, this is just to say that the idea of trying to say I bought the unforced capacity is to say that I have purchased only the reliable portion of the resource doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Jamie?
I'm just trying to understand this like in a multi-year level contracting example, right? So if you're setting UCAP every year and you're entering a 3-year agreement for system capacity, it's unknown what your UCAP value is going to be the next year and the next year. So how does an LSC go about contracting for that uncertainty?
That's a fair question, Jane, but at the end of the day, it's still a contracting question, right, about if you are unable to meet your unforced capacity value that you provided today, as the seller of that capacity, you're responsible for replacement. I believe there are similar provisions in the pro forma contracts today that say if you can't provide that level of NQC, you're responsible for replacing it. So those types of risks aren't any different today than they have been in the past.
So you're saying maybe they just contract for year one UCAP for all 3 years, and if they can't meet that UCAP, then they're deficient in their showings potentially as they move forward, so they have to find that capacity elsewhere, right?
Well, so that's what I'm saying is it's a contracting issue, right? It's not necessarily, doesn't need to necessarily arrive at a point of deficiency, but the contracts, like I said, as I've looked at the pro forma contracts, they say, you're responsible for providing, this number of NQC megawatts towards meeting my requirement. If you're no longer able to do that, then you will be the ones providing replacement capacity. So the LSE is not on the hook for the replacement capacity. The LSEs whose NQC or UCAP that has gone down is now on the hook for supplementing.
So then they're contracting for UCAP. They're not contracting for NQC.
I mean, I think we're splitting hairs here in a way that doesn't necessarily. Well, I guess I'll stop and ask a question. What's the point you're driving at here, Jamie? I'm sorry.
I think I'm just trying to understand it a little bit better so we can work through some of the potential issues, right? And so if you have a bundled product and you're saying just continue contracting for NQC, right, because you have bundled local and system, but then you have system being based on UCAP, so NQC is going to stay the same, but your UCAP could change from year to year. To me, it seems like it gets complicated for contracting for both the products. Like, I want to contract for all attributes of the product, but it's changing from year to year. So how do you manage that risk? And
we can talk about that over time. I don't think I'm the best person to stand up here and try and offer that. But again, today, if I'm a solar provider, my NQC can change year over year based on what somebody else does, not even within my own power under the methodology that's currently being implemented. So we have this problem. This is not new or changing. It's putting a different tag on it, and that's fine. I'll work with you there. But it's an existing product or existing challenge that we have today. It's just a little different variant of it. I just want to make sure that, okay, we'll work through it more. Carrie, I believe I saw your hand up, and then we'll come to you, Eric.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to say that you contract for NQC, like you were saying, so it wouldn't be UCAP, at least under the existing contracts. And I think there's been some confusion even with outside those walls when we talk about this proposal about what you would contract for and what you'd have to buy. And I think it's really good that you keep reiterating you still have to offer in the NQC, you still have to contract for that. So I just wanted to say I appreciated your clarifications with Jamie, and I think that's something we should all keep in mind because yeah, the UCAPs may change, but you still have that underlying NQC that will remain somewhat constant, and just like today, if it's variable, contracts account for that. So I don't see any major contracting issues. I do take your point, though, that LSCs will have to procure more potentially under this, but I think that's the intent, right, to get more capacity on the system.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the intent is to try and get good capacity and reliable capacity, and they may actually, if everything works out well, be able to procure less in the sense that they buy more reliable, and so instead of buying 2 megawatts at 50% UCAP or 50% forced outage rate, they buy 1 at 0, and that's a cheaper means of procurement. So there's opportunities for cost savings of potentially buying more efficient and reliable resources. So I don't necessarily want to say it's about getting more resources, it's about getting better or more right resources onto the system, but I do appreciate the point about, that the contracts do put it in place, and again, to the extent that there's some changes over time that exist, those are and can be taken into account in the contracting space, so I appreciate that.
So one more quick thing. Just on that point where it's not more capacity, one of the things that's been really hard for me to wrap my head around is the dual constraints that Eric was talking about, because you're right, sometimes you'll have to procure more, but maybe sometimes it'll be less, and that'll depend on the relative value of UCAP to NQC compared to the CAISO's UCAP requirement to the NQC requirement. And all these numbers, I think, are put out by the CEC. So you could, for 2018, for example, show what the UCAP requirement for the 1 and 2 peak plus 9% is compared to the monthly RA requirement. And I know you don't have the supply side yet, but the demand side might be really easy to show. And I'd appreciate that if you guys could put that together.
Let's see what we can do. Eric?
Yeah, Eric from Medicine. So I'm not convinced that it's not a contracting problem, and for reasons very similar to what Jamie said. So yes, I do have the NQC, and yes, that value is going to maintain, but I've also got the fact that its UCAP is going to change, and now I've got to deal with that within the contract as to what that means and what I have to do with it. And if the result at the end of the day is that the ISO looks at it and says, overall effectiveness of this doesn't get there, and therefore I have to go buy something as a backstop, that has an impact on me. When that has an impact on me, I need to try to address that in my contracting, and it's something that doesn't get done today.
I want to clarify. I'm not saying it's not an issue that would – it's an issue that seems to require change and adjustment in some of the pro formas, and I get that. But, again, I don't think it's new in concept. So again, I'm not doing the contract, so I'll put that aside, and I'm happy to listen to folks about more of their contracting concerns to the extent that we can minimize some of the complications. Great, I'm happy to do so. But I think there are contracting tools that exist that can help deal with it. That's all I'm really asserting, Eric.
There are, as long as we know exactly what it is that we're buying and exactly what the requirement is going to be. This is going back to my position that I'm not convinced that having an NQC and a UCAP value are necessarily a good thing.
Okay.
Let's get to what it is that we need so that we can address the contracts to be able to address what is needed rather than just shooting for a number that's a convenience number.
Okay. And again, I've mentioned some of the challenges that we've been facing earlier about kind of moving away from some of the NQC valuation, keeping that there. We're open to suggestions on that. If we find reasonable solutions from stakeholders, we remain open to other solutions. We haven't arrived at them yet, so we're happy to hear what you have to offer.
So, Carl, on that, can you guys put together a list of exactly what the difficulties of getting rid of NQC are that you see? I mean, I think I could probably go through the paper and figure out what they are, but it would be nice to just have a list of, items 1 through X of exactly what it is, because I heard 2 of them so far. Are there enough letters between 1 and X?
Let me take my shoes off. Okay. No, for those of you on the phone, I was counting on my fingers. So I think the answer is it's a fair request to put forth the reasons that we've been struggling with. But again, we want to make sure that the number we put out there in terms of the local capacity requirements has a meaning, how much capacity we need. We haven't been able to figure out how to basically create that transposition between the NQC to UCAP in terms of the requirement is 500 megawatts of NQC, which translates to 450 megawatts of UCAP, because how much you need depends on forced outage rates of the resources that are shown. So there's a certain endogeneity problem that exists there too still that we're trying to work through. So we can try and provide a list prior to the next straw proposal so that folks have something to offer solutions to. I think that's a helpful way to go about doing that, so that we don't just kind of sit there and say, hey, let's see what the ISO comes up with based on what I heard at the stakeholder meeting. We'll do the best we can, Eric. Peter?
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I want to go back to slide 40 and just because you're basically saying that you'll do 2 different tests, an individual LSE test and a portfolio deficiency test. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming the portfolio is sort of multiple LSEs across the whole.
We'll get to that in a moment.
Okay. Well, no, I wanted to ask, that's a change from what the current practice is.
Yes, it is.
I mean, the current practice pretty much is the ISO looks at the full set of showings by all LSEs to see if there is a deficiency before it drills down to see whether there's an LSE deficiency.
Well, that only exists for flexible. That's how we do it. For system or for local, we will do an assessment of the local RA resources that have been shown to determine a collective deficiency. So what we do for the local, and again, the 2 tests we're talking about here do kind of mirror the local process more than one might initially think.
Yeah, but for the most part, the current methodology is just to look at the system first before you look at the LSE.
Well, for system RA, we look at have you shown enough? And then, if we get enough deficiencies, we can go in and look at whether or not we need to do a CPM, but the allocations of those costs go right to individual deficiencies. There's not a collective deficiency at a system level at this point?
No, but you don't go to look to the individuals if there's not a system deficiency. That's my understanding of the way the evaluation is currently done.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's an accounting. Do we have enough system RA capacity from a spreadsheet?
From everybody. If we don't, then we're going to start looking for local.
Well, even before that, I mean, at the system level, it's that individual deficiencies are most important in terms of backstop cost allocation at that point in time.
Okay.
Maybe I can help. Are you switching the order that you do CPM and backstop in terms of do you have to have for an LSE to get an individual cost assigned to it, do you have to have a collective deficiency first?
So, Gabe, I'm stealing some thunder. Sorry, dude.
Well, let's just talk about it tomorrow when we have this on the agenda.
I think the simple answer is we're working through that. Our initial thoughts are, again, trying to balance the idea of free ridership or leaning with the idea of saying, well, when we run the portfolio test, does that have to come up deficient or not for us to have backstop or cost allocation authority? And it works. What Gabe's going to talk about tomorrow will be going through that process that we're looking at and evaluating the showings, both from, I guess in order, meaning what comes in first, what we do, what we notify of, and when the ISO takes specific action. So I'm going to try and defer to Gabe tomorrow unless people are really, really excited to learn about it, and then even then I'm going to turn it over to Gabe to answer the question. So I'm going to turn to the phones now and see what PowerX has to ask here. I'm assuming this is marked. Mike.
Hi, Carl. It's Mark Muller Powers. Could you just back up a slide? Just a few thoughts on the back to the UCAP NQC discussion. Just want to make sure we that slide there. Just want to make sure we understand it. So today, as it relates to, for example, system resource adequacy for wind or solar, it's quite parallel, is it not, that if you have a 100-megawatt solar farm and the CPUC has established a certain capacity factor for a given month for system RA, that would be very analogous to a UCAP. And if those percentages, if someone enters into a 10-year or 20-year contract and that percentage changes, I think there's a current proposal out there to change it, it needs to be dealt with in the contract. Is the buyer of that 100-megawatt solar farm the one who bears the reduction in capacity value, or is the seller have to bear it and replace it? Is that, am I missing something there? Is it not largely analogous that it's a contracting issue that and it is a contracting issue, but it's one that has to be dealt with similarly for solar and wind that are using the LCC?
Well, that was the analogy I was attempting to make earlier, if maybe not as elegantly. But yeah, that's you know, as the NQC value declines as you move to LCC, there's still terms for replacement in those contracts. Now, again, I'm not saying that this isn't different, but again, I think I'm going to take another step back, not on slides, but kind of in temporally, and remember that today part of our stated objectives from this morning was alignment with particularly CPC, but other LRAs in understanding and implementing this. So the idea of, you know, what else is there and how the contracts are formulated, we are seeking alignment on those fronts. We want this to be something that is easily understood. So
I think of it as I understand that it may be inconvenient to have to deal with it, especially as there's existing contracts. Have to figure out, well, which side bears that, the buyer or seller in each contract. But I think it's something we commonly experience. I mean, even on the energy side, I mean, you can buy a fixed quantity of energy where the seller's responsible for buying that quantity of energy, or you could buy all the energy associated with the nameplate output of a wind or solar or hydro project, then the buyer deals with the variations in that energy. And you have to contract for it, and you have to figure out who's bearing the risk of that quantity going up or down relative to nameplate. I think the second point, I was just thinking about this as you were articulating it, and it seems like the NQC and UCAP, those two different numbers, and I know you've touched on this, but I think it's really necessary on two regards. One is the must-offer requirement needs to be based on the NQC, because your UCAP, the difference between your NQC and your UCAP is dealing with forced outages. And so you need to have a must-offer based on the NQC so that you can cover that forced outage amount. Otherwise, it doesn't really hold together. And the second part is, if you have a resource that's selling resource adequacy to multiple buyers, how do you split that up? And it seems like a very challenging problem if you don't have two numbers, one that's more nameplate based and one that's more resource adequacy qualifying credits based, which I think NQC and UCAP generally line up with. So you need to have some way to split it to multiple buyers, and you need to have a must offer at the higher number so that you have that forced outage amount covering the difference.
Okay.
Did I get that right?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. I appreciate it, Carl.
I'll have to go back and check the tape, but once we get that recorded. We don't have the video assisted review here today, so we can't go back and overturn calls. So, sorry for anybody that's been watching soccer. That joke made perfect sense. Thank you, Chris. All right. Anyhow, so I'm going to continue to move forward because, again, I want to be cognizant of time. We do have a lot of materials to cover. I want to be thoughtful about what we cover, too. So we talked about not being able to buy the quote-unquote good capacity. We did get some comments on this front to say, hey, can I just buy the unforced capacity and then I'll just start providing all the replacement when it actually does go on forced outage? Well, that kind of obviates some of the benefits of trying to move to the unforced capacity evaluation, which is to say, no, you don't need to do that. We've done that already in advance. So to say that you just bought the good stuff and you'll provide substitution says, well, then we still have substitution. And then on top of that, trying to calculate what a resource's forced outage rate then gets really wonky, because we have to try and figure out, and yes, that's the technical term, we have to try and figure out when you provide replacement capacity in that instance, does that mean you're no longer on forced outage? I don't think it does, but I've not seen any of the other ISOs that are using UCAP allow for this type of replacement to say, hey, I'm undoing my forced outage, so don't count it against me. So the long and short of the individual showings we get to here in red, which again is kind of the incomplete story, and I recognize that because it kind of leaves you hanging for that suspenseful ending, which again, always leave them wanting more. So Gabe, that's you. Bring it home tomorrow. LSEs that fail to meet the UCAP requirement will be notified of the deficiencies, provided an opportunity to cure, and may be subject to backstop cost allocation or UCAP deficiency charges if the deficiency is not cured. Now again, this is what's going to bring people back tomorrow. They're going to want to know what half that stuff means. This is always one of the challenges in writing a 98-page paper, which is trying to figure out in what order you should define and describe things. So we left that one on the back side of the discussion, not to say it's unimportant, but to simply say when we get to these points of the test, that's when the story is nearly complete. And so we've kind of put those to the back side to say, let's try and solve this first. Let's try and have the standards and counting rules known up front, and the test that will be known up front, and then we'll talk about the corrections to it tomorrow.
Before your corrections to it, will the LSEs know what their UCAP requirement is to be able to avoid this deficiency in the first place?
We figure we'll put it into a little hopper and we'll turn the crank and we'll start pulling ping pong balls.
Sounds about right.
Okay. As long as we're clear on that fact that we will be fully transparent and make that known. Obviously, I think at the end of the day, the LRA will have the ability to allocate requirements to their jurisdictional LSEs as they deem appropriate, as they do today for local and system and flexible. At the end of the day, ours is a number over the course of the system that we're looking to have fulfilled. So we're not going to make a specific allocation proposal on UCAP to an LSE any different than what we're talking about to an LRA.
So would it be an LRA failure to meet the UCAP requirement then?
So again, this is the challenge of writing a 98-page. It's a little humorous, but it's trying to think about this in a linear process. And I get, the mind jumps to certain places immediately. The requirements will be known. LSEs will know what their proportionate share is. Then how they address that, the numbers of the UCAP for resources also will be known. And then whether or not they meet that or not, that comes in. We'll know immediately when the showings hit SEER whether or not you've hit your share of it. We'll notify you, and then we'll talk again. Gabe will cover that process tomorrow about what that deficiency means. It may mean something, it may mean nothing, but we've also, part of what we wanted to do through this was look at what disincentives are created in some of the tools we have in place to see if we can remove some of those disincentives for providing additional RA, and even maybe look at some ways to say we're going to disincentivize leaning or undershowing and provide some other incentives for maybe putting a little extra in there. So we're going to talk about all of that fun stuff tomorrow. You're making my job really hard up here because I want to talk about all this stuff.
Yeah, and then maybe it's a topic to take up tomorrow, but I mean, you can see my concern and the reason I said the LRA. Imagine that the ISO says the allocation is 50-50 between these different LSEs. It's under the same LRA, the LRA says it's 60-40. The ISO figures out the deficiency and says, well, now I'm going to build this on a 50-50 basis. One LSE makes out like a bandit and the other one gets a huge amount of cost that they otherwise wouldn't have. That's why I'm questioning this logic, and if that's tomorrow, we'll have that discussion tomorrow.
Well, I think what you're driving at, and I think we covered it very explicitly for the flexible piece, and maybe not as clearly for some of the other pieces. But again, as long as we're provided with what the requirements are from the LSE, that goes into from the LRA, that goes into our SEER system. We have that in our SEER system. So if they're providing that to us, if they're not, well, there's a whole other big bunch of questions. But, you know, as long as we've got that requirement from the LRA in our SEER system, then we can, you know, that I believe you call it hosing, won't occur. I thought you said that. I don't know. I wasn't listening very closely to you. Well, it's been a long day, and I've been up here for like 15 to 20 minutes. All right, Carrie, and then again, I apologize. I'm not trying to deflect questions. I just do want to move expeditiously through the material.
Carrie Bentley with Western Power Trading Forum. Hopefully this will be quick. I actually got really confused in that conversation, not about Eric's point, just simply about, are you assigning this on the LRA or the LSC? And then is the LRA going to allocate the requirement, or are you assigning it, or are you taking the LRA's requirements and then doing a backstop check using the UCAP and then assigning it to the LSCs based on your own assessment?
Okay, the question in and of itself confused me, but that meant that my explanation led to the confusing question. So it's on me because I was trying to figure out what was going where there. But I understood the point of the question is the long and short of it. So we do need...
I feel like I'm being dumb. It's not me, it's you. It's mutual, Carl.
You're welcome to take it however you'd like. It's not me, it's you. We're moving expeditiously through the material, though. So the LRA always has the opportunity to do an allocation to its jurisdictional LLCs. That's the way it's working for local system, flexible. They have that allocation given, again, I'll probably misstate something along the way here, but CEC is providing peak load, coincident peak forecasts. They'll give part of that to the PUC. The PUC then doles that out to its jurisdictional LLCs. In theory, it could do it however it really wanted to. It has a particular methodology. We calculate local. We have a methodology for allocating that to the LRAs. Then the CPUC, again, doles that out to their jurisdictional.
Whoa, so but just no need for the details. You're keeping it the same. LRA is still going to determine system, flex, and local requirements and pass those along to you. Step one. That's still staying the same.
Allocations.
The allocations, yeah. So each LSC will get their requirement from the LRA just like today.
Their allocations, yes.
Okay, and then what happens?
We check them.
Against the UCAP or against the NQC or against both?
Our first check will be against the NQ, or against, I knew I'd say that. Our first check will be against the UCAP. That is the individual deficiency test that will be identified, that we've identified in bullet 1 on slide 40.
But, so you're saying you're checking it, but then what are you checking it against? A CAISO determined UCAP value or a LRA determined UCAP value?
Who's UCAP value? What, the generators read UCAP?
No, the UCAP requirement. You're allocating your CAISO UCAP requirement to, well, you're doing an individual check, so you have to be checking the LSCs, UCAP resources, UCAP value resources against something.
The requirements we received from the LRA. Okay,
so then the CAISO at some point is going to tell the LRAs what the UCAP requirement is, and then the LRAs will apportion it out to LSCs?
We're still working through the details on that, and I think that's part of where the coordination efforts come into play on this with the LRAs. But something along those lines, yes.
Okay.
I know.
I don't think I understood that before. So the proposal is contingent on the LRAs agreeing to allocate some sort of requirement to the LSCs?
It works way better that way. So this, no, I get that frustration on it.
Can I jump in? Because this is Jamie from the CPUC. I think it's important that we're not just creating requirements that would be to backstop, that we create requirements that would be for the bilateral market, and then the CAISO would backstop. We let the bilateral market first try to procure to meet the requirements.
Yeah, and that's
what Carl's getting at, is that it would be easier that way.
Yeah.
So the proposal is set up, or is being proposed that way, not being proposed to backstop before setting the requirements, but to basically align with the LRA, allocate out the same requirements, how the LSEs procure bilaterally, and I mean the LRA would also be doing its deficiencies in alignment, hopefully, with the CAISO's deficiencies. And if there was a failure, there would be penalties, but also CPMs.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. The goal is, by and large, I mean, as I noted earlier, we relied a lot on the local model as far as like how things get set up, built from the ground up, allocated out and back, and the coordination and collaboration with the LRAs is critical here. Again, I'm not going to say it has to happen, but we're really not looking for a world where it doesn't happen. We really want that to be a core element of this.
Okay, thank you. I now understand why I was confused. That is a little more complicated than I thought.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. It's not you, it's me. Was there another question in the room, or I thought I heard somebody on the phone? Nothing on the phone? Okay. So let's move on to the portfolio analysis. I mistakenly had my paper slides turned to the wrong page, so I already read this slide to you all, but I'll do it again briefly, which is to say, when we're looking at the portfolio analysis, we're really talking about trying to assess the fleet of resources that has actually been shown for RA to make sure that those resources are going to actually work well together. As John pointed out earlier today, you know, the goal really isn't just serving peak, it's about serving load. That happens more than just 1 hour a day or 1 hour a year. So we're going to be looking at that and trying to develop a portfolio test. The RA resources will come into the ISO. We'll conduct a production simulation to try and assess how well they work together to meet our reliability needs. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the timing of all of this today, because quite frankly, one of the biggest challenges of this aspect of the proposal is going to be the turnover timing on this and what we have to do and how quickly we have to do it. We're not looking to do this assessment in the year-ahead showings. Right now, those year-ahead showings are 90% for the CPC jurisdictionals. And I think those, correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, those are only covering 5 months at 90%?
Yes.
Okay. So we don't have a ton to deal with in the year-ahead showings, and so we could run the test, and I can tell you it would not look good. So we're really only looking at this for the monthly RA showings. We're not looking at it for an annual showing, because, again, until we have either the entirety of the fleet or the vast majority of what we expect to be shown, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to try and do that. So when conducting the portfolio analysis, we tried to figure out and go through different variants of this, because, again, one of the things we see happening in some of our planning spaces is looking at whether or not a deterministic modeling scenario is sufficient, or if we need to add the level of complexity to move to something that's more stochastic. What we're trying to do here is strike a balance with the idea that we have to manage both computational and communication times to load serving entities to identify what we've got and trying to figure out which one of these is most viable. So we've looked at 3 different variants of this, and we've got the descriptors up here. The net load deterministic is really trying to say that we're feeding in a known profile of load, wind, and solar. The generator output is stochastically determined using the forced outage rates, but it's done outside of the process and then fed back in. This is what we consider to be a fairly much more deterministic version of the model, so we can run it much more quickly. We're not relying on nearly as many assumptions, and the computational time is much less than it is from some of the full stochastic models. We also know the load profiles in that scenario too. And finally, when we're looking at this, one of the key things to think about is, well, what are we talking about when we say we're going to run an iteration or multiple iterations? We're looking at an iteration here presently as a predetermined time interval. We're thinking it is most likely a single month. So for any given month, we'll have 30 observations, 22 to 25 days of weekdays and the remainder of weekends. So we get, even in a fairly deterministic model, we still have at least some level of statistical vision because we have 30 days of observation. Generator stochastic, we still know the load profile, but all the generating profiles are determined stochastically in an outside process and then fed back in. And then full stochastic, again, we're doing something that is, I think, at some level more akin to what's happening in some of the ISOs run IRP studies, where everything we're trying to do has full stochastic elements to it, load, wind, solar. I think the only new element here would be some of the generator forced outage rates. Peter, you had the first question, then.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I guess you're jumping here to talking about the form of the aggregate test that you're looking at, and I guess the question I have, and I think is what is the ISO worried about in doing this test? It certainly isn't meeting peak demand, because you're already capturing that peak demand and you're capturing the outages associated with that peak demand.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm assuming, and it looks like you're worried about different things here with the different types of tests. I mean, certainly the net load deterministic says that you're basically only worried about not just meeting the peak load, which you're getting from the peak, but you're also then worried about what happens when certain resources are not available. Can I meet that peak demand as well? So my basic question is, what is the ISO worried about in terms of not having sufficient resources to do? Is it flexible resources, or is it, I'm just, help me think about this.
No, so the interesting piece about what we're proposing here is it is a portfolio, which is to say, and it is production simulation. So in theory, the goal is, can we serve load through this production simulation? Again, the models that we've outlined here are just differences in how we can put the parameters in. They're not necessarily fundamentally different in what they're modeling or looking to achieve. They do have differences in terms of what ultimate failure looks like of the portfolio, meaning it's inadequate. But, as John noted earlier, like I said, we're worried about being able to serve load in all hours. RA is not necessarily simply, or RA's goal is not necessarily to simply serve peak. It is to reflect our ability to serve load in all hours.
And so I guess I'm just, if you're basically saying, okay, I want to make sure I can meet load in every single hour with the portfolio I've been given in the RA showing to meet system requirements.
Yes.
Okay. And so, doesn't that argue for something that you've got to look at all hours of the month in terms of seeing whether or not that portfolio works? If that's what you're really worried about?
Yeah, that's what we're proposing. That's the production simulation will do.
I'm confused about how net load deterministic works in that regard.
It's simply saying the parameters. What are the parameters? The net load pieces that we're plugging in are known. We're not determining them stochastically. So we know the load profiles, we know the wind and solar we're plugging in, those are known profiles. We can say, last year we saw solar doing this and growth factors look like that. So here's what our solar profile is going to look like, similar to what we do in today's flexible RA study, where we say, okay, this is what our solar profiles are going to look like.
I guess I'm confused. I'm confused about what exactly the nature, but you're basically saying it's a production cost simulation test.
Yes.
All three of these?
No. These are
I'm just trying to understand, because I think you're asking, let me just check what you're asking. Are you asking, is this the appropriate test for getting at the appropriate need for the deficiency?
What I'm stating here is that we have looked at 3 different production simulation models that we could run to test whether we can serve load in all hours. These are the descriptors of the 3 different models that we've explored for that test. Okay, but the test, what we're exploring is, can we serve it for 30 days, 24 hours a day? That's the primary question we're looking to have answered. Now, we can do that in a full deterministic model where we say, I know all resources will be available all the time. I know what load's going to look like. I know what solar's going to look like. And then I just run that. And it's fully determined ahead of time. Okay? Not very interesting, but we could do that. What we're more looking at is saying, since we've gone to this UCAP methodology, and we've talked about that, let's talk about implementing and putting into our assessments of RA how it actually works together when we talk about the forced outage rates as well, and saying, okay, given these load profiles, given these solar profiles, and given these forced outage rates, can we still serve load?
I'm a little confused. Okay, so the RA requirements, the UCAP requirement will be set based on a hourly load profile for each LSD? No.
So the specific determinations about UCAP, again, right now, UCAP is primarily focused on service and peak load in the high load hours. But that's not to state that there are hours in which, due to use limitations, fuel availability, fuel capacity, i.e. how many megawatt hours I can store, that I can't run into capacity and or energy deficiencies, well, capacity deficiencies due to I have no energy to produce in hours outside of those peaks. For example, if I'm sitting at, Eric was sitting there at 9 p.m. saying the sun's hardly setting. If we don't have the sun and we have forced outage rates for our generators, are we still going to be okay at 9 p.m. when the sun is setting, or 10 p.m. when the sun has set? Are we still going to be okay during those still very high load hours, but hey, we don't have the solar capacity and now we've got forced outage rates?
Okay, so are you proposing then to have a requirement that's more granular to capture this need? That, just going back to the MCC buckets that don't work, are you proposing something that does work that, keeps us from relying on use limited resources during these hours?
So I think the best thing that we can offer at this point in time is transparency. We're not offering a requirement per se to say you have to buy this much 24/7, this much, 6x8. We're not proposing those type of buckets anymore. But again, what we have out there is, again, forced outage rates, solar profiles. We kind of know when the sun comes up and when it sets. That tends to be pretty well known. They can predict that now. So we have information on load and net load that we can make public and try and provide transparency. But to say that Edison has to, or PUC jurisdictionals have to buy this much 24/7, this much these blocks, we're not proposing that. Again, we're trying to.
But you will be backstopping to that, right? Ultimately that's where it lands. Is we have to send the right signals to the bilateral market so you get what you want.
And again, there's nothing that we're doing here that forecloses the opportunity for an LRA to establish those types of buckets or guidelines based on the transparency we provide them, but we're not proposing those types of requirements or those limitations. What? We're trying to balance the idea of, what we can set, what we can and should be setting requirements on, but again, how much they want to set those buckets, those start to become procurement decisions. That, again, we want to defer to them about what an LSE or what an LRA wants to have in their procurement portfolio. Go ahead.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths speaking, but you're basically making them reliability decisions. And I guess, if you do a thought experiment about this, if you've only got sort of two types of units, you got one type of unit that's only available in the peak hour every day. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you've got another type of unit that could be available 24/7. Mm-hmm. Okay, I could meet my UCAP requirements just by buying the one type of the first type of resource.
Yes.
And everything, and I would meet my requirement.
Yes.
But only when you get to the deficiency test that you basically say, oh no, I didn't get enough of the second type of resource. Mm-hmm. But you didn't tell me how much of the second type of resources you needed or how much to buy. And so you're only basically finding a deficiency that would be a collective deficiency. It's not clear sort of how you would allocate what the responsibility is for making up that deficiency.
Well, I guess I'll pause and ask the question of the room, which is to simply say, do you want us defining those requirements at the ISO?
I guess from my perspective, how do you know that you're actually meeting what the requirement is if you don't tell me what the requirement is? I mean,
I'm sitting here and saying that we've got a local model right now where we conduct studies and we can say, we can put you in a general understanding without setting horrifically complicated local RA requirements where we have to count each resource for every local area, sub-area, and constraint that it's addressing. we have this effectiveness factor that does a pretty good job, but it's not perfect. And in some ways, in some levels, it can be off depending on whether the first contingency is on the east or the west. Okay, so we've made simplifications in local, and we've got to a place where people generally understand this is what the profile within a local area looks like, this is what our local needs look like. And I can look at effectiveness factors and know how well I'm doing and what the risks of backstop costs are. Now, again, we've tried to build that model out and scale that model out to the idea of we can provide transparency to say, if we're looking at some of these requirements, do you want us to specify each LRA has a requirement of A, B, C, and D? Now, again, I think that there's challenges with that in and of itself, to say that we would be designing, well, I'll use the PUC's terms, MCC buckets for LRAs. We're trying to avoid that. But at the same point in time, we can provide transparency so that you know this is how effective this resource is. This is what, how much energy I'll get out of it. I don't know that we're going to stand up here and offer to specifically spell out and exempt and provide this pure, hey, you're good, don't ever worry about anything ever again because you hit that number on an accounting sheet. That's not what I'm up here to sell.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, not knowing what the requirements are, how it's, you're setting up by basing the requirement only on the peak demand and resources, how resources perform at that time. You're basically not getting enough of an information about how the lack of performance at other times of the day that could be causing essentially the definition of the deficiency using the test that you're proposing is incomplete in being able to provide an incentive and providing the wrong incentives essentially to the market, because you're basically saying that the only thing you need to have is that peak demand to meet that peak demand in the way that's set up, without providing more information about the effectiveness of resources to meet other types of needs in other parts of the day. Then I don't think to some degree you're providing enough of an incentive to go and procure those types of resources.
So here's where I'm going to ask for help from you, Peter, which is to say you've asked us to provide more information. I don't know if you're asking for more requirements or what. In your comments, tell us what other information is needed that we may or may not be able to provide. We'll do our best to see what we can provide. But in comments, just let us know what other information is needed, absent saying, having hard and fast requirements. Again, we're trying to stay out of that to allow the bilateral procurement to manage that in coordination with the ISO and the PUC. So, John, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah.
Eric, do you have?
John Gibbon, California ISO. Peter, I just want to say that resource adequacy really is through the jurisdiction of local regulatory authority, and so this idea that RA is not only meeting your peak demand but also your load requirements, that it's really the PUC that needs to ensure that its LSCs are procuring not only the right amount of capacity to meet the peak, but really can meet their load requirements as well. We are trying to inform that, but we're not, like Carl says, going to try to dictate, like an MCC or MCC buckets like the PUC has done. Furthermore, LSCs should have a pretty good idea of what their energy requirements are and what their profile looks like. And so if they're going to actually meet their load requirements, then they probably should procure a portfolio of resources that have the capability to meet that profile and those megawatt hour needs. And again, if you're procuring as an LSC a portfolio that is all solar and you check the box that says, hey, I met my capacity, but you know very well that you can't meet all your energy with those types of resources, then beware. So I guess I'm confused why you'd want the ISO to go down this path when, one, the LRA, this is really their responsibility. The ISO needs to inform it, and we all have a responsibility under the RA mandate to meet our load requirements.
Okay. We have the ask out there, so I'm going to try and move on because Just briefly looking at our schedule, I think we've now officially cut back into Chris's time again. Yeah, well into Chris's time again. So I'm going to let Eric make a brief point, and then we'll check the phones really quick, and then I'd like to move on if we could.
So this is the problem that I mentioned very early in the day where I asked, would the ISO include cost causation in here? And the discussion that you just had, John, doesn't get us there. That's where the problem is. In local, it works very well because we know that the effectiveness factors are a very good set of information on whether or not that's going to get us where we need to be. But looking at this, I look at things like load. Is it known or random draws? Well, is the ISO going to cap that at the peak load for that month, and it's just the load profiles that change? You said you know what your own load profile looks like. That's true, but if my own load profile is totally different than everybody else's, I might procure to my own load profile, but the ISO still ends up with cumulative deficiency, and I still get a bill. So it may not necessarily be good enough. The wind and solar profiles, again, we're using ELCC for what the qualifying capacity is, but now the ISO is going to say, well, that profile is not good enough, so I'm going to change it yet again for the month?
No, we didn't say that.
That's what it looks like. So what are you doing with the wind and solar then? What is that called?
In which one?
So in each of those, you've got wind and solar. One is a known profile. One is randomly determined for each iteration with fixed installed capacity. That sounds to me like you're going to say that the output profile is different.
So now we get to the model we're going to use section of the discussion, which is to say our preferred solution is to, walk before we run and to use the net load deterministic, which is to say as much input as we can have known. Is it perfect? Are we going to have some of the statistical robustness that we would have from more stochastic iterations? No, we won't. Okay. We know that, but we have a complex model that's we're going to be working on. We're going to have about 7 to 10 days to turn it over, run the model, assess it, and communicate with our market participants about how it went. And so we're going to work through something fairly simple.
Okay, so in that case, Carl, what does it mean for a generator forced outage schedule determined randomly prior to the assessment? Because I thought that's why we were using UCAP to begin with.
Okay, so that part's stochastic. But the profiles that we've used in the ELCC for wind, solar, and load, we can, for example, CEC is going to be producing load forecast. We can continue to use that. That's coming up on slide, I think, 47.
Okay, so I might be missing something here, but if we're going to a UCAP methodology to figure out what these resources are worth after forced outages, and yet we're using some other randomly generated number here, I don't know why we're doing one and then doing this. I don't get it. So we say your UCAP is worth 85%, but then we go and run this model, and this model says, I picked a random number that was 70%. And suddenly you procured something that doesn't have the value that you guys are testing against. I don't understand how that works. Am I missing something?
Probably.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, tell me what to do.
No, you're in a portion of the thought process we went through on this, which is to say, when you're looking at doing this portfolio assessment, there are two ways you can use the UCAP value. So you can use it as a UCAP value that derates all of the capacity. Just it comes off, and that's all you model, that's all you can produce in that production simulation. That's one option. So that, 100 megawatt resource with 90 megawatts of UCAP, when we run the production simulation, you run that at 90 megawatts. That's the most it could ever produce. It can never produce 100 megawatts. That's one option. In that scenario, the UCAP, as you've defined it, that's what it means, right? But keep in mind that UCAP value is based on, as I think it was Tong said earlier, it's based on distributions, which is to say that sometimes you're 100% forced out, sometimes you're 50% forced out, sometimes, you're forced out for portions of the day. So there are times where that 100 megawatt resource is producing 0, 75, 90, 100. Our expectation is that it's coming in at, 90% UCAP or 90 megawatt UCAP, it's actually producing close to 100 megawatts most of the time, but when it's not, that's important to know. It's not saying we're not putting it in there at the UCAP value. We're actually very much exactly doing that, where that random draw, the random draw is specifically pulled from the probability that the resource will be on forced outage. So, hey, we can have that distribution being uniform distributed around a fixed forced outage rate and say, some percent of the time you're going to be 100% available, some percent of the time you're going to be 0% available. But those distributions, those draws, happen in a separate iteration. So they're pulled out, they're run, so that I know that 90 megawatt UCAP resource, I know when it's producing at 100, and I know when it's producing at 0, and that's what we get to plug into that model, so that we're not plugging in simply saying we're just assuming everything is at its full unforced capacity all the time. You end up with different results. So we've explored both. We continue to explore both. But the idea of, you may end up with a different result if you are 100% forced out than having a bunch of resources that are 10% forced out, because the alignment of those forced outages matter. And, I think we've heard a couple of people say, I'd rather have 500 1-megawatt resources than one 500-megawatt resource, because the probability of those little resources all going on outage at the same time is different than losing, or the impact of losing them is different than losing one 500-megawatt resource. So, again, we've thought about the different ways that we can model and utilize UCAP, and I feel like people are getting hung up with the titles on this, and I apologize. I'll take the blame for that. But the goal here really is to model UCAP as we know it through a somewhat stochastic process, which is to say we know its probability of forced outage. Let's calculate a profile about when that resource is on forced outage, plug that into the production simulation, and then run it and see what happens. But we still would end up at the same UCAP value.
Okay, I appreciate the explanation. I guess then the next part that we would need to understand is what information is an LSE going to know when they go to do procurement to be able to do this in the bilateral market to avoid the ISO needing to do a backstop, because that exists for local today.
I will put forward the same ask of you that I put forward to Peter, which is to say, please provide us with the information you feel you need so that we can start to develop a framework in which we can try and provide as much as possible.
I need to know how you're going to derate it. I mean, well, but that's the problem. It's a modeling output, right? So I guess then, is the ISO going to provide all of the database and all of their models so I can go run it myself with my own procured resources?
We'll have to look at how much transparency we can provide. I think when you find out what model we're running, probably not, but I expect it'll be a process by which we have to be transparent about what our results were and what we found.
Well, we also have to recognize that with an increasing number of load-serving entities, that this becomes a much more difficult thing for any individual LSE to figure out, because their portion of the game is much, much smaller.
Understood.
So even if I go out and procure the perfect resources that causes the ISO to have a perfect set of resources for my load, if they don't for anything else and have to go and do backstop procurement, I'm taking on a cost because of a quote-unquote cumulative deficiency that perhaps I didn't contribute anything to. So I'm just trying to figure out how close LSEs are going to be able to get and what the probability of this actually happening are with a large number of load-serving entities.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jamie, did you have I thought I said, you good? All right. Mark, I'm going to go to you, and then Peter, I'm going to move on if it's okay. Okay.
Thanks. It's Mark with Calpine. I want to try to boil this up a little bit and say what I think makes sense to us. I think early on in this conversation you said with, the changes in the generation fleet that you have, the diversity of load-serving entities, that you need to know not only can you meet the system peak, but can you meet the duration of load that occurs. You took the first step of that in the LCR studies by showing people load duration curves and how much capacity was needed in a particular local area. I think it might help next time if you just give us an illustration of what this duration study would look like. What are the inputs, what are the outputs? I think that's part of it. And what I hear Eric and Peter both talking about is the implementation details are important. But I think the first step is to convince everybody that you really do need to look at the duration of load service as opposed to just the peak. Okay. So there's no question in there. It's more just a comment.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mark. And I think that first off, let me be clear. I think the transition to ELCC is a recognition that it's more than just about peak. Okay, I think that's commonly recognized at this point in time. Otherwise, we'd be using different calculation methodologies for addressing the capacity evaluation of different resource types. So I think we've already agreed that there are concerns about duration of energy production. So I view that as commonly accepted and agreed upon point. If there are those out there that disagree with me, I'm happy to have that conversation. But I think that in and of itself is a recognition that a resources capacity value is not simply about an instantaneous point in time. I think IRP is also demonstrating that we're looking at models and their ability to serve load. That's when we start to identify that, hey, it's not necessarily the peak load where we're having problems. It's those hours right after it. Those are the problems where we're having LOLE. And so, again, we've taken that as a given, that the energy needs of the system and the capacity questions, there's not that full alignment as there's been in the past. And so that's part of the reason why we started moving forward with this. And again, we look at it as something that, the ISO has the ability and the clarity when all of the RA showings come in together and knowing what our constraints are and how to model them, we have the ability to process that and to know whether the resources as they come in on a month-by-month basis are able to serve those hours as we need them. Now, again, I understand that the titles on this slide 44 were maybe not the most helpful. I'll accept that. But conceptually, really what we're looking at is what Peter identified earlier, which is to say, making sure that we can serve load in all hours. Now, I understand the regulatory concerns that have been raised by the LSEs. We're open to trying to address them to the extent possible, but we need more information about what we need to provide to help facilitate that, be it in requirements here or in coordination and collaboration with LRAs. We can find solutions to this, but I think we all kind of have recognition that peak is not the only need anymore. There's more to it than that. It's a bit more complicated question than it's been in the past. Okay, so I'm going to step down off my, I think, my little soapbox there. And I'd love to check the phone.
Christian, do we have anybody in the queue?
At this time.
Again, you could, okay. Again, if you do have a question, you can just press #2, and Christian, just let me know if anybody enters.
Okay. Moving right along. So we looked at a couple different platforms that we could run the production simulation on. We looked at just simply, conducting using our market optimization model. Our IOC, which Abdul, I always forget, it's the, come on, give it to me, the IOC.
Integrated Optimal Outage Coordination.
Okay, I simply call it IOC because it sounds moderate.
Definitely not IOC, please.
Okay. Is it a soft C or a hard I? Soft I? IOC? No? Okay. They want to know whether it's IOC or IOC? Okay. We'll come to the phone in just a moment. So we've looked at these three variants, or three different models. The summer assessment, which is a Plexos model, it's a bit of a more simplified model than our market software, the outage coordination software we're using, which basically the difference between the market model and the IOC really is the ability for the model to consume some of the other outages that we have, the planned outages, be them transmission or generation, to know how well things are going to work together. And so those two models, the first two, the market and the IOC, are much more complicated models. They'll take a little longer to run. But again, part of what we want to manage is to try and have an assessment that mirrors what we're actually dealing with. We try not to make things up. We know that an inherent point of modeling is that you do make a little bit up, but we know what our system's going to look like, and to the extent that we know the planned outages, we think we should take those into account. So I'll get through this and then I'll go to the phones. So right now we are supporting a net load deterministic model using the IOC. It provides the best balance of the time constraints, the complexity, and the data output. So again, we'll get 30 days. It's something that we think we can run in once we get the interface between Sierra and IOC to consume all of the data. We think we can run it in a time frame which will allow for us to interpret the data and then provide the necessary time for market participants to act on that information as needed. So as I mentioned earlier, the processing time is critical. As Gabe will talk about tomorrow, we're really looking at about 10 days in which we're going to be able to get these showings in and then process all of the information. It's a lot to process in 10 days. I know we're really good and we're really fast at a lot of things here at the ISO, but we've got to have dual running this, and so we got to take that into account too. Thank you for laughing, Abdul. Well, that's why you cut me off before I could have my follow-up, that Abdul has I'm able to make that joke because I know Abdul is very confident and can do this probably in 7 days, but I don't want to put that kind of strain and stress on him every month. So, you know I love you, Abdul. So anyhow, and also we've looked around as we've tried to assess this. I mean, everybody we see, for example, all sorts of production simulations being run in a lot of different spaces. The reality is that that's great if you're in academia, and I have a month where I can run it. We're looking at something that is not so, we're much more time constrained, and so trying to conduct this much more quickly is going to be a challenge. We haven't seen another ISO conduct such a portfolio analysis, but we also haven't seen an ISO with some of the ambitious transitional goals to change their fleet that we've seen. And so, again, now is really a great opportunity to do this before we're kind of behind the 8 ball saying, wow, the fleet has changed so far, so fast, and we're really looking at and finding out the hard way if some of these resources don't work well together. So I'm going to pause at that, and I know there was a question on the phone, and so we'll stop to take that.
Okay, Christian, we'll go to the phone lines.
Hi, this is Doug Berchin from Flynn Resource Consultants.
Hey, Doug.
Hi, Carl. So it sounds to me like going into the month, you're planning on at least taking into account the probabilistic outages of the generators. That's where you're leaning, if not the load. But so if you're doing that, then that's what you're going to use ultimately to determine your backstop procurement. So it seems like we want to align that, and we want to align the upfront procurement requirements with what you're ultimately going to be doing with the backstop. And so I don't think we need to answer right this moment, but it seems like we've got to look for that alignment so that we can satisfy Eric and Peter's concern.
Yeah. So I will issue to you as well, Doug, what other information or procurement obligations or requirements are you looking for from the ISO to help facilitate that? Or what would you need to know to the extent that we start putting this information out there and trying to derive who is or who should be the right source or base of such requirements, I think is probably a very good first step in determining what those requirements should be.
Yeah, and I guess I'd say we should all be thinking about that. and
I would be grateful if we all did.
Come up with a solution that sends us all the right signal to procure the right resources so you get what you need. And then I just have sort of a follow-up, which is thinking about substitution requirements. And it sounds like, at least for forced outages, you're saying you're doing the initial assignment of the requirements. You're taking into account forced outages, so you don't need to do substitution. And
that's right, Doug.
And I think that makes sense because here you're taking that into consideration as well. One question I have is, why wouldn't you do something similar for maintenance outages so that no one would ever have to substitute because you already would have taken into consideration all the outages that
At some levels we are, Doug. Again, with the idea, I think Chris is going to talk tomorrow about some of the planned outage piece of this and some of the transparency we're hoping to add to help resources know when planned outages are easily handled by the ISO and other times when they're not. So I'm not going to get too much into that. But also part of the IOC that we have the capability to deal with is looking at some of these planned outages. So some of them will be already taken into consideration through the IOC. Again, I think we continue to dig down into what exactly that means and what these results would actually look like and what that output would look like.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. So if you're modeling those plant outages when you do this run, you've already accounted for the need for any kind of, you've already explicitly accounted for them, so you don't need to replace it.
Yeah.
And because when I'm worried about some of the earlier comments, my concern is similar to what people were raising this morning, which is we don't want to have over procurement. We want to get the resources that you need to meet the requirements. And if you're factoring in both effectively planned outages and forced outages in setting the need, then we should be all set.
Again, we frankly not run the production simulations at this point in time, so trying to think about the impact of, if we've got IOC and it's got planned transmission and generator outages, yes, we've accounted for those. We'll have to drill down a little bit deeper into specifically how to deal with the planned outages in that space, Doug. But I think by and large, what I'm more interested in people taking away from the discussion is the idea of beyond a simple spreadsheet type assessment of adequacy. So, with our schedule officially completely blown, I'm going to roll through my final 3 slides here, I think, relatively quickly, because I think by and large we have either covered the material or we'll get into greater detail through this process. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we're only planning on modeling the RA resources in this assessment. Any additional resources that we get actually participating in our day-ahead and real-time market, that's great. Then we can kind of sub the energy in and out and move that around. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the RA capacity is able to meet our needs. We do recognize that, as with any study methodology, we have to have some inputs. So our current thought is that we'll be turning to the CEC's 1 and 2 hourly load forecasts as kind of a baseline to set our net load deterministic models so that we have that input. The CEC is now developing that information hourly, which is great. Kudos. And so, again, relying on that hard work and putting it to good use. We are also contemplating including the load following requirements. The basic thought behind this is that our model will be run hourly, and so we do lose the granularity of, that we'd have in a 5-minute dispatch, let's say, as opposed to what we see in an hourly. So having the load following requirements is a portion of that. And again, having known profiles for wind and solar so that, again, we're not generating anything different than what is kind of a scaled-up version of what we already know. That doesn't mean those will be the actual usage or production from those resources in the production simulation. They just represent maximum potential outputs of the resources. And then the generator availability, as we mentioned earlier, would be determined using the forced outage rates and again, to others' questions, the NQC value of the resource. One of the big questions that comes out of this is, fine, you ran a production simulation model. What's it all mean, Basil? And the answer is, well, that depends on what metric you've taken to define adequacy or failure of the production simulation. We've really looked at just kind of a service of load and LOLE as the 2 primary measurements. We don't think we'll have sufficient statistical robustness to look at an LOLE given the initial model we proposed. So we're simply saying, can we serve load? And again, we've noted, what is included in serving load. We're not looking at like stage 3 emergencies as, hey, we served load. That doesn't count. So again, all the pieces of that that we'll have to identify a portfolio deficiency. So if we fail to meet these requirements or these standards, the ISO will identify a portfolio deficiency. If additional action is not taken, we'll declare the collective deficiency. We will provide a cure period so that entities that maybe have a little extra capacity under their belt that they didn't show initially have a chance to fill in gaps. If nothing is done, the ISO could conduct backstop procurement using the CPM competitive solicitation process to finish curing those deficiencies. So realize that there is a lot to consume and process here, but again, the big message that I've taken away from this is that there's a request for more information for the ISO to provide. I'm asking folks to tell me what that is. That will help me. But I think that there's a general understanding of simply looking at a spreadsheet and saying we have enough capacity is no longer an adequate test, and this is the ISO's proposal to start moving past that. No final questions allowed, Eric.
It's just a quick one on page 48. And this is Eric from SEE. The next to the last bullet, must maintain load AS and load following requirements. What are you measuring here? Is this just measuring system, or are you measuring flex? Are you, because it seems like load following should have been captured in the flex that you've shown, right?
So do we capture flex and load? There's load following. What's that?
I think I would just say I think that we're including it in here as part of the portfolio analysis because we want to test to make sure that everything meets that, even though perhaps it might have been laid out up front as part of the flex requirement. It's, again, kind of to the extent of doing the testing and make sure that under the assessment, does it really meet all of those three things, load, AS, and load following needs.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, just trying to understand it. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Lauren Carr. I suspect she's going to bring us home for today. And then, Chris, you're back on all morning tomorrow.
Hold on, Carl. I didn't get that last part. So you're going to have an ancillary service requirement as part of RA and a load following requirement? Is that going to be a monthly requirement? I'm just confused by this because you're doing...
We have it today.
So that's going to be known ahead of time for each individual LSA?
So the peak load required, so we know what the forecasted peak is. We know what our ancillary service requirements would be based on a peak and production simulation, so you know what your AS requirements are in any given interval within that production simulation, so we'll be making sure we can maintain all of those.
So this is not new?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Lauren Carr. I'm an infrastructure and regulatory policy developer here at the ISO. As Carl mentioned, I'm going to finish up the day today talking about must-offer obligations and bid insertion modifications that we're proposing as part of this initiative. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. Resources shown for RA will continue to have a must-offer obligation under our proposed framework. We've talked about this a little bit already, but under the UCAP framework, a resource's must-offer obligation must be consistent with the NQC value. So, for example, if a resource is shown for 100 megawatts of NQC with a 20% forced outage rate, it would be providing 80 megawatts of UCAP, but it would still have a must-offer obligation to bid 100 megawatts of capacity into the CAISO market. Just to compare to if we were to put the must-offer obligation on the UCAP value of 80, then on average we would only receive 64 megawatts of dependable capacity from that unit. So that would be inconsistent with what we're relying on that unit to provide. So that kind of example just demonstrates why we want the NQC to be the basis of the must-offer obligation. This also allows the CAISO to simplify forced outage substitution because it would basically be providing the substitute capacity up front. And it would also allow us to eliminate existing forced outage substitution goals and also potentially reduce the reliance on rain. So this next slide has an example of system RA must-offer obligations just to show how the must-offer obligation is tied to the NQC and also what it would look like if a resource is only shown for partial RA. So in this example, we have 4 resources, 2 sell the full NQC amount and 2 only sell for partial RA. And then in this example, all the resources have an NQC of 100 megawatts. They all have different forced outage rates. Resource 1 has a 5% forced outage rate, Resource 2 has a 20% forced outage rate, 3 has a 15%, and 4 has 10%. Also, as I mentioned, Resources 1 and 2 show the full NQC amount of 100 megawatts, and Resources 3 and 4 show a partial. So Resource 3 shows 50, and Resource 4 shows 75 megawatts. The next column shows the UCAP calculation based on what they're showing as RA capacity. So again, as we mentioned, the NQC shown for RA times 1 minus the forced outage rate would give us the UCAP amount for each resource. The next column shows the summary of the NQC versus the UCAP. So the NQC is 100 for the first 2 resources, but their UCAP is less depending on what their forced outage rate is. And then for resources 3 and 4, we have the partial NQC of 50 and 75, and their UCAP is based on that. And our next column shows the system RA must offer obligation, which is tied to the NQC value. So resources 1 and 2 have a MU of 100 megawatts. Resource 3 has a MU of 50, and resource 4 has a MU of 75. So this example was just to show how we determine what the must offer obligation would be based on the resource's NQC, and also what it would be if a resource is showing for a partial RA rather than its full NQC amount. So in this proposal, we are proposing a standard must offer obligation that would apply to all resources unless specified under an exemption. I'm sure a lot of you have seen in our BPM for the reliability requirements, we have a table that has a long list of must offer obligations by resource type. And as part of this proposal, we want to somewhat simplify that by giving a standard must offer obligation and then listing some exemptions. So on this slide, we have come up with a standard must offer obligation of 24/7 bidding into the day-ahead market for all resources and 24/7 bidding into the real-time market for resources that have been committed in the day-ahead or that can be committed in the stuck horizon. Peter?
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I guess the question I have is, why is the must offer obligation 24/7 when the calculation of the NQC is only 16 hours of the day?
I think that for the calculation of the UCAP would be including outages that take place in 16 hours of the day, and that's the time when we see our greatest need, but then we also have needs to meet our load 24 hours a day.
But aren't you saying here that you have an obligation to be there all the time, not just on those 16 hours of the day, in terms of it's only the 16 hours of the day that you're looking to see an adjustment of what the performance was? I mean, I really have a tough time understanding why the must offer obligation is 24/7. Is the ISO really worried that you're not going to get enough bids from your RA resources from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m.?
So, Peter, this is Carl. I think there is a growing concern that sometimes in the middle of the night, again, we're looking at a fleet that, as we transition, again, maybe your argument is, yeah, we're not there yet, and that's fine. I can buy that to a certain extent, but a fair portion of our fleet's not going to have any output in the middle of the night, and that's going to displace other capacity that may, absent a must-offer obligation, might not be available to us in the middle of the night. So if your assertion is, I don't understand why you need it for all resources 24/7, I think there's a better argument to say that to that than to say that we don't need some sort of must-offer obligation 24/7.
For some resources. I guess the question I have is that the way you've done it is you're doing a top-down in terms of saying everything's got to be 24/7 unless we give you an exception. You're not sort of saying, okay, what do we need? Let's build up the resource obligations for what do we need for the hours of the day that we need it, and essentially put the must-offer obligation on that basis. because if I'm a resource that has limited fuel availability because the sun doesn't shine, I'm basically getting a pass from having to actually bid in the ISO market or having an obligation at a time when essentially you're relying on every other RA resource, which counts to some degree over the same megawatts of UCAP to meeting that requirement.
So I just, again, I want to pause for a moment. I mean, at some point, and we'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow as well, one of the things that we learned and heard through the wonderful world of flexible RA is that if you have more than one must-offer obligation, people get confused. We received a lot of complaints and concerns about, well, do I have it 5 hours? Is it 7 days a week? Is it 17 hours? What's my must-offer obligation? And there's understandable concerns about that. So trying to have a plethora of must-offer obligations, I mean, we haven't heard a lot of market participants saying that they think that would be helpful. What I've heard is that they think that will be more confusing.
But don't you have a plethora of obligations based on the availability of the resources?
In our proposal that we're putting forward today and tomorrow?
Absolutely.
No. We've tried to consolidate the offer obligations into a single offer obligation over all the tech.
So you're basically saying that there will be bid insertion for solar resources in the middle of the night? I mean, I'm just trying to understand what the RA obligation and what you're placing on certain resources is.
The obligation for solar resources now is to bid to their forecast.
What's that?
To bid to their forecast.
But the point to some degree is the resource types are not being treated equally in terms of being able to meet the RA, but yet you're counting them the same to be able to meet the requirement.
So are you advocating for a single 24/7 must-offer obligation for all resources?
No, I'm not. I'm not. I'm basically asking, can there be some logic provided, or at least some rationale for what the resources can do for what the obligations are? And I guess I'm just confused as to why you're building up from having a 24 for everything and then giving exceptions for things that are not available.
Okay.
Let me jump in here and try to provide a little bit of feedback on this question. I think it's fair. And again, it kind of ties into the debate we were having a little bit earlier about, providing requirements up front for meeting our portfolio needs across all hours. It's really, we have a bit of a, chicken and egg conundrum here on some of this stuff. I think we can understand that people want to have requirements set out up front. I think we're kind of saying, hey, that's very much in the purview and jurisdiction of the LRAs, particularly the PUC, to set out some of these requirements up front. I think we want to make sure that anything that we propose really does align with those kind of requirements and not try to establish our own requirements that would be in conflict perhaps with the LRAs. That's a big part of this. And so, we're kind of here trying to figure out how we should do all this. And so that's why we're asking you guys to give us some input and ideas about how we can set the requirements up front. But I think, beyond going into something like where we start setting MCC buckets or something like that, that's why we started doing it this approach where we're saying create a standard, a 24/7 move for everything that's a normal traditional RA unit, and which can meet those kind of requirements relatively, normally. And then we have a list of exemptions that we're going to go through that we listed in the proposal as well, to try to, break down the ones that necessarily have been accepted in the RA program by those LRAs and by the CAISO, and folks are procuring. And so that's kind of the way we've got to where we are today. That's the logic behind why we're presenting it in this way at this point.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on to our next slide. This slide gets into more of the bid insertion rules. In our last proposal, we did have two ideas for bid insertion, and we've kind of narrowed down on one of them. The first idea was to get rid of bid insertion and treat non-bids as a forced outage or potentially apply rain penalties. We decided to move away from that idea and kind of move forward with our second option, which would be to apply bid insertion to all resources that are not use limited and to resources with a registered use limitation and an opportunity cost. We recently implemented our CCE3 initiative, where resources can register as use limited and receive opportunity costs that can be managed in the market. So that is one driver for why we're moving forward with this proposal. By maintaining bid insertion, it would also enhance the CAISO's ability to identify forced outages, because resources would need to submit an outage to avoid being dispatched by the CAISO. It also provides reliability to the ISO by ensuring that we do have bids in the market. It would also would not create a disincentive to show RA capacity. We feel that this is one of the key principles in RA enhancements that we want to follow, which would be not to disincentivize from showing RA capacity. And the other option where we got rid of bid insertion may have presented this scenario. As with the must-offer obligation, there may be some exemptions that would be required for certain resources that fall outside of the category of non-use limited or registered use limited with opportunity costs. Any questions on that?
Just a clarifying question, Jamie, CPUC. So CAISO proposes to apply bid insertion to all RA resources, right? RA.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that you're not applying bid insertion to resources that are outside of what's being submitted into pipelines?
Yeah, we did mean just.
So I'm just trying to would not create a disincentive to show RA capacity, because part of that is that LSUs don't want to show their link. Like, they might have more contracted for RA than they're showing into SERA, so that still would be an issue.
So this is Carl from the ISO. Is the disincentive you're talking about simply the fact that there'd be a bid inserted for them as a disincentive to show it as RA?
I thought one of the principles, the original principles, is to not create a disincentive for LSUs to not show RA that they've already contracted for, that, you know, because they would show their length and then RAIM would be applied to that length, and then they would incur potential penalties associated with, you know, those resources. So they hold back that RA, and they don't commit it to the CAISO, even though they have it under contract and they're bidding it into the market.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to connect that point with that original principle.
So remember, going back to some of the discussion Chris had earlier, which is, you know, will we continue to have that standard application of RAIM that we have today? And the answer is no. We're looking to move past that. That's the point of the UCAP. So putting that on there now, if you're on forced outage, you're on forced outage whether you're RA or not. That's going to be reported and captured. That's part of the requirement that we'd see. You may not be bidding, but if you're on forced outage, you have to report that you're on forced outage. So we have the forced outage rate that we can calculate. So that disincentive is kind of moved to the side now. We don't have that anymore. So if you have RA in place without the fear of a RAIM world, would you not simply then show that? What's the disincentive to showing that RA capacity? Now, if the assertion is that simply having a move is a disincentive to providing RA capacity, then, wow, you know, having to actually provide the capacity you sold seems to be a reasonable conclusion to reach. So again, we think we've by going the route where we'll continue to provide the bid insertion support that I think, you know, market participants by and large appreciate. If something goes wrong, it's there. It's not often used, but it's nice to have that backdrop. Without RAIM, there's just not the disincentive to show it, and so we're just trying to continue to provide support for it.
And let me add on to that, Carl, too. So I think to try to really touch on what you're asking, Jamie, I think, you know, beyond that, the idea that we're saying here is we looked at maybe just doing away with bid insertion, and we think that that would create a larger disincentive to show capacity, okay, because people would now be impacted on their forced outage rate for 3 years. There would be obviously a greater incentive for them to hold back capacity, not to show it to the ISO. If we said, okay, let's just get rid of RAIM, or get rid of bid insertion and then count all these, non-bidding periods against their forced outage rate. So that's kind of what this point is getting to your question, I think specifically, is that, yes, I think we would admit that, anything might create some amount of disincentive, but this option perhaps creates less of a disincentive for that.
I'll go with you first, and then we'll move to this side.
Thanks. This is Mike Whitney with NCPA. I think we've been pretty consistent in our comments that a move provides a disincentive to show, and I think it's completely fair that if you do show, then yes, you should have that must offer obligation. But the bid insertion is a little bit harsh. It automatically goes to $0 bid. So I don't know to the extent that the bid insertion rules could be modified to be a little bit more forgiving. Maybe that's something to think about.
Well, yeah, and Mike, this is Carl. In the two options we looked at, this was, by far the A, easier, and we thought B, more reasonable solution. It provided support that many market participants, do like the bid insertion piece of it. But again, as a load-serving entity that procures capacity, would you not want it shown and participating simply because of an offer obligation? I guess I struggle with that being such an overwhelming obstacle to participation that it'd be a huge barrier to showing additional capacity to the market. Again, when you see some of the planned outage pieces and the incentive pieces we're putting out there, we think we've put in some other elements of this proposal that way outweigh that impediment.
Well, yeah, I agree. The proposal makes sense, and it's not an overwhelming disincentive. I'm just trying to provide feedback from a generator owner's perspective.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Hey, this is Gabe Murtaugh from the California ISO. Just to clarify there, you mentioned that bid insertion would happen at $0, and I know that bid insertion does happen at $0 in the RUC markets and the ancillary service markets, but I think primarily it's something a little bit more akin to default energy bids for the day-ahead markets and the real-time markets. Yeah.
Yeah, to add on to the description, Kaiso, as well, I think we can clearly, take a couple of moments to review that, current bid insertion rules, back when we talk shop here and think about that. But I do think, it's a fair question to ask, but that's a good clarification, Gabe, because I was thinking it kind of along the same lines, that it's not just always a $0 bid that's being inserted there. Thanks, guys.
Go ahead. Okay. Go ahead.
Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas and Electric. My favorite subject are grandfathered CTs. We have a number of those that will be going up in less than 3 years, and both the must-offer obligation and the bid insertion is a real concern to us. Either they won't be available to the Cal ISO because of contractual limitations, so opportunity they may run out of starts very early in the year.
You were breaking up a little bit there, Vic, but I'll just jump in and, did you want us to try to take some feedback from that you guys are a bit concerned with this part of the proposal, or I think I just kind of missed the punchline there, Vic?
Basically, it's one of the integration questions of how all this hangs together. When certain units lose their opportunity cost grandfathering in a couple of years, what's going to happen if they get bid insertion at extremely low levels? They're going to be selected all the time and run out of starts, so then they'll be unavailable, and I don't know if it'll bring down their UCAP in the death spiral, or if there's no RAIM or they have RAIM penalties or whatever, but those type of issues do impact us directly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That helps a lot, clarify that. And I would just say I think we really do need to think about the details here and how some of these things would be applied. The implementation of this is going to be complicated, and we're going to run into those things where we do need to address that sort of situation on particularly, specific resource types and those kind of things. So, provide those examples in your feedback for us. We'll try to, think a little bit harder, longer, and provide those details in the future, I would say.
Thanks. Yeah, and I have a note to consider that detail going forward. So if we have no other questions, I will move on to our last slide on the must-offer obligations and bid insertion. As we already mentioned, the CAISO may need to define exceptions to the 24/7 must-offer obligation and bid insertion rules for certain resource types. We proposed an initial list of exemptions in Table 5 of our revised straw proposal. It is a kind of long list, and a lot of the exemptions mirror the existing exemptions listed in the reliability requirements BPM. So for the full details on what we're proposing there, you can look in the revised straw proposal. We didn't want to go through each one since a lot of them did mirror existing exemptions. But that was our initial proposal, and we are looking for feedback from stakeholders on that. We did want to call out some specific proposed modifications that are a little bit different from today's rules. The first being for NGR, we proposed that their must-offer obligation should reflect the charge and discharge capabilities of the resource. So the bids that we have reflect the full capability of the resource. We also proposed a change for RDRRs to have bid insertion in the real-time market only. RDRR resources are not required to participate in the day ahead, but they must submit real-time bids that are 95 to 100% of our bid cap, and then they're only used by the market if the CAISO declares a warning or an emergency. And then for regulatory must-take units, we propose that any portion of the resource that is RMT, the resource should provide documentation of their availability to the CAISO beforehand and bid per their availability. And for any portion of the resource that is RA and is not regulatory must-take, it would bid to the standard must-offer obligation. Eric?
Eric from Edison. So for the RDRR, since you said it's between 95 and 100% of your price cap, what would be the bid insertion?
It would be consistent with the 95% to 100%.
The 90. Okay, but that's a range. So if you have to, yeah, it's 95%.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? This is the last slide on the new section. Oh, we have one on the phone? Okay.
And Christian will go ahead and take the question on the phone.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson for CLECA. So to follow up with what Eric just said, so this is if they don't submit a bid, then you automatically insert a bid and you would be at 95% of the price cap, or excuse me, the bid cap?
That's correct.
Any other change, or is that the only change you're talking about here?
That would be the only change that we're considering for RDRRs at this time for the must-offer and bid insertion rules.
Okay, so the fact that they don't submit a bid, then a bid will be inserted for them. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so that's it for the new section. I think we're finishing right on time, right at 4 here, so.
Yeah.
Kind of.
This is Chris. So I think, we have a couple other items. We want to get through planned outage process enhancements and then also the import stuff, but both of those are going to take a significant amount of time. I don't think we want to keep folks here later. So we're going to, hold off on getting into those because I think either one would take us, far longer than 30 minutes probably to get through. So hopefully we can get through both of those in a couple hours tomorrow morning and then transition to some of our other, flex and the rest of the agenda that we have in mind. But I do think, we built in a bit of cushion tomorrow with our time frames and the agenda because we figured that this would probably happen. So, don't worry, we're going to try to cover everything we can tomorrow. But I think it was a good discussion today, so thanks for all the feedback and input, and we'll see you guys. But I think we're going to start early tomorrow, so go ahead, Christina. Thanks. Take us away.
Yeah, so we are going to start at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We'll be in this room. So we'll see you back here tomorrow. Thank you,
everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Conference Enhanced. You may now disconnect.